two dope dudes, bringing you the news, leading you to much success with all their insightful views. Do you grow yourself or buy from the top shelf? Are you here to take the reins and gain back your health? Whatever it is, you know the biz. Leave a light, crack a pipe, and let's get on with it. If you want to acquire the knowledge, you don't have to go to college. You can just come hang with Aaron and Dave.
Welcome to the Elevated News Podcast with Two Dope Dudes. We're a podcast focused on discussing local and national cannabis news and culture. I'm Aaron.
Hey, I'm Dave.
Hey, Dave. What's going on, buddy? How are you?
Not a whole. I'm really good actually.
I hope you're fired up.
I'm as pumped as you're about to see me on one of these shows.
Yeah, I hope, chat, you're ready. We have the first person that we collectively asked to be on the podcast many, many months ago. We met him. He is a scientist of sorts. He is a technician. He is got a degree in chemistry, I believe. He may tell me I'm wrong, but has worked
Okay.
on the cannabis side for Revolution back in the day. He's worked on the hemp side as well. He's touched just about everything there can be to touch in cannabis, and we're excited to have him on. Alex Mallek, our friend.
Hey.
Hey, what's
what's up,
going on,
buddy?
brothers?
I didn't want
Doing
that to
pretty
go on
good.
too long, but I wanted
No,
to
of
give
course
an
not.
accurate representation of who you are.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that. How you guys doing today?
Dude, honestly, way more pumped up because you're here, bro.
Dude, same. I'm finally like on the podcast. I'm very excited to be here. I've always really enjoyed talking to you guys offline at a lot of the different meetups we've done, so
Yeah.
it's really cool to be here.
Thanks. It's very much appreciated. I know your time is limited and you have a lot of different things going on. So thanks for, giving us your time. Hopefully we can, explain some cool things to people out there.
Yeah,
Because
of
you're
course,
a
it's an honor
really
to be here.
interesting guy. You're a super interesting guy to talk to. We talked
Well,
earlier
we're a
for
bunch of
about
interesting guys.
Yeah.
So
Shit. No, I respect. I think more than anything, Alex, when we've had conversation, the level of sure that you are, the level of confidence that you have in the way that you speak about the things that you speak about. And I also, you speak about one of my favorite things, which is cannabis, right? You know this plant as well structurally um, as hopefully I can say that I do ethically, like in efficacy, right? Like I respect when we had our first conversation. I said, "Oh, this man's special. Like you genuinely understand cannabis in a way that if everybody was able to understand the truths that you speak about in the way that I say that you speak about cannabis, there wouldn't be the back and forth that has gone on for a very long time. What's the difference between cannabis and hemp? And we'll dive into that a little bit. What is Delta 9? And is it the same thing as THC? And there's all these little things that the consumer still has no clue how to speak on. Or um, even then, like a lot of the people who are the sellers of now don't even know the truths of, right? So I respected that about you from the beginning. And I'm so pumped to just air these things out publicly so that everybody, Aaron and I are one thing, right? But I come from a retail background with a little bit of sales experience and whatever. My degree is in nothing. So it's hard to speak the accolades outside of 10 years of direct cannabis industry experience. I don't have the chemistry background and the things that you do. So once I just want everybody to know out there, once Alex says it, y'all better just write it down in a book.
Yeah.
Okay.
You might want to get a notebook out.
Yeah.
Rewatch this one. This is going to be a good one, I promise.
That's probably the truth for everybody. But
what I will say though is it is science, so there is subject to change. So there is a lot of asterisks on a lot of different things that 10 years from now we're all going to be laughing, going like, "I can't believe we thought that," you know. But as far as what we know today, I'd like to think that I have a pretty good grip on it.
bingo. God, it makes me even like you even more. Um, no, I genuinely, because a lot of people are like, I, I know everything. What's like, oh, I know a lot from now, but I have to continually learn as time goes on, or I fall behind, and two, like it's not even real anymore. It's not even
Yeah.
true anymore.
Things
So
change,
Yeah.
things move.
yeah.
Yeah, no, 100%. I will say, so I've done a lot as it's related to like processing, a lot of the chemistry, formulation, testing, and stuff like that. But when it comes to like growing, for example, not exactly my big strong suit. I've actually never touched
Hmm.
like a plant in a growing capacity in my life. It has always come to me from guys like you, and then I, do what I need to do to it. So that's about the only let me put my phone on. But that's about the only thing that I would say that like, I'm a little shaky. I'm kind of
Yeah.
more dependent on guys like you who are touching the plants like every day, nurturing them, changing like the different soils you're growing it in, and what newts you give it, and so on and so forth.
I, and that's cool that you say that because as the end of it, right? So Aaron's the beginning because he's growing the stuff.
Hmm.
You're the middle because you're processing it, and I'm the end because I'm delivering it. But I desperately depend on you to give me accurate representations of what I'm going to deliver across the counter so that at least if you're doing this in a medical setting, you have some kind of consistency or some mathematical thing to go off of, right? I mean, it's probably more scientific because it is more of a trial and error and a very individual experience. But if we know the truths of it, 100 milligrams of something is 100 milligrams of something, period, right?
Hmm.
Mhm.
So that's why, like, I think it's really there's a lot of different aspects of how this plant needs to or where this plant needs to go to be delivered to the end. Um, but yeah, I respect that you're like, I don't know that aspect of it because I sit back and every time I go, hey, I don't know either of these aspects. I know really the mathematical side of it, right? Like, and I know the um, at least anecdotal truths that I've seen from a lot of the medicinal users of. And I always throw this at medicinals because I think all prolonged use of cannabis is probably medical use of cannabis, according to what we call medicine. But to the people who are directly using it for condition, it's symptom alleviation, right? Period. But a lot of them are directly treating their condition as a with a full umbrella purely with a cannabis product, right? Or different cannabis products. So um it was really neat for me to see that aspect of it, but I respect both of because without the person growing it with some passion and without the person actually testing it with some passion and then delivering a true product, it's very hard for like I said, that's why I want you to speak way more because the consumers are so confused still. And a lot of that is because we don't even know the plant, right? Uh,
Yeah, and I would make the argument that a lot of it too is actually partially due to a lot of the different companies, right? So a good example is like the indica and sativa.
I mean,
My
that's
father-in-law asked me like, "Hey, like, are these gummies indica or sativa?" And then like, you want to like get into the weeds, no pun intended. I'll probably do that a lot. Um, into it, like, is it really the terpenes and stuff that are implying that, like, sedative or, like, kind of exciting effect? Is it actually just the cannabinoids? Is it a distribution of these different cannabinoids in certain ratios? Right? The jury's still kinda out on that. Like, we did just discover, like, the endocannabinoid system,
Mhm.
within the past couple decades, and, obviously, with federal barriers to research and stuff, there isn't a whole lot of, literature out there to really predicate an opinion on. But keeping on that train, right? So there was a really good study I found that basically looked at like the distribution of different terpenes and whether or not they kind of had this implied like sativa or indica effect. And what they basically found is that there's like a super loose correlation, which is to say that like that isn't really the case. Um, but the thing is the consumer wants, and manufacturers for what it's worth, want definite labels, Right, because you wanna say, like, "If I put this thing in this little package and I tell you that this is gonna wake you up and it's gonna make you feel good, man, you're gonna wanna go party and dance on a boat," right? And they wanna do that as part of their packaging and their marketing and stuff like that. Um, then it kinda sells this illusion that that's actually the case, even though it's not. But then, like, you as a bud tender, right? Are you really gonna enter into, like, a 30-minute discussion with every single patient who asks that question? It's just not practical. You would sell 0 weed at all.
Bingo.
Right? Like, you kinda have to distill things down, and so it's like a useful crutch. Um, but, like, that's a good example of a misconception where, um, the education's kind of required, but I don't know that, like, a dispensary is, like, the right place for it, right? I feel like long form, podcasts like this to kinda discuss the nuance of it is a good place. Kinda like Aaron and I were talking about earlier, and this is more prohibited by regulation, but, like grow tours, you know
Hmm.
what I mean?
Mhm.
Like, if I wanna learn about beer, right? I've been to the Netherlands and Belgium. They have, Heineken and Stella through AB InBev, right? And so they do a lot of the manufacturing globally for those brands of beer. But you can go into their brewery and see the stills, and, like, you'll go into, like, their formulation room, and there's a brewmaster guy. He'll explain to you, like, what we're doing with the hops and how we put it into these vats and how we take them out, right? How they do the quality control. And, like, that's where you as a consumer would actually know, like, "Oh, okay." You, like, see the equipment. You see the staff, you see the facilities, you see the ingredients, and you get pretty solidly without ever having to necessarily work there every day, like how those products actually work. But that doesn't really exist for cannabis because like the regs are prohibitive. Um, and you can sort of make an argument that like, a decade ago, uh, the pervasiveness of cannabis wasn't really there. So it was like a novelty at least at like a regulated, institutional level. So like, yeah, there is a real concern with like people like driving a van in and smashing. So like, yeah, you need this huge vault, and like any of these growing facilities need to have like guards and gates and passes and all that sort of stuff. But like now, really, like 10 years later, California's legal, like half the states are legal. Everyone's pretty much smoked pot or eaten a gummy, whether through a regulated licensed dispensary or just from like their buddy who grinds up hash and makes cookies or brownies or whatever.
Hmm.
And I don't know that it's like this frenzy where people are going to break in and steal stuff. I still think you need to have like operational security, but like this whole like it needs to be in this veil and you can't see it as a consumer is kind of weird. And I mean, you even know this from the dispensary side, right? Like if I go to California or Michigan, I can smell the bud. I can like look at the vape and be like, wow, I like the way this feels and smells good and it looks good, right? Um, but in Illinois, it's like, no, it's
Yeah.
it's like radioactive. You can't look at it. We keep it all in the back, and it's like, why? Come on, right?
Well, and yeah, it's really easy to hide trash when you're unable to see anything. And
Yep.
as the producers of, you've had a very good opportunity to do that, right? Take advantage of, and some of them do. They produce trash and whatever, right? It's behind a package. But anyway, I think, yeah, I think you're absolutely right. At least in Illinois, we're super behind the times
Yeah.
of what we need to do to progress this thing in the proper way. I mean, Aaron and I constantly preach access to it, and I think access to it in the same way you're speaking too. Like, even go to Michigan one time, and like you said, be able to look at what it is and see the differences. Right? There's a I think there's a happy medium in there, right? There is a deli style that it makes sense to exist in, and then there's this also pre-packed, high quality, nitrogen packed, whatever, kind of so that it's untampered with, but at least give me a view to it. Let me see it. Let me interact with it at some capacity.
Yeah,
And
like name any other product that you buy a lot that like you would have to go through the same sort of hurdle. You
no,
know what I mean?
well,
Like if
and
I
so
want to
that
see a beer, I can go to a brewery and actually sample it, like if I'm at a bar, right?
the
But like
only
if
thing that we can even equate it to is a pharmacy. It's purely, you'll never touch that. That guy back there is the only one who touches it, and then he can come out and tell you about it. But as consumers, all of us understand that we're talking about drastically different experiences here. Though
Yeah.
I think one of the bigger problems is the amount of people who go to the hospital because of this, because of the paranoia or the misuse, because they're, hey, I'm used to eating an entire candy bar, right? Because I like candy, so I'll smack this whole entire candy bar. But if you've never used before, you probably are eating a tenth of it, right? Or whatever. I mean, we all understand that there's a difference to who's consuming, but
Yeah, it's like the
um,
quintessential, like, "Oh, I didn't feel anything," so you just keep eating, and next thing you know, you're getting 100 milli vanilligrams straight to the dome, and you've
well,
never even never tried cannabis before.
that's why, like, when I speak about this a lot, like, I think it's very basic, right? Method of consumption, cannabinoids, terpenoids. What does that mean as a whole is so individual, right? Because, like, what's our rate of absorption in different things from you to me is drastically different, especially in, like, our stomachs, right? We can tell that physically and how we appear, that we absorb things differently, right? So, like, I think that if we stick to the basics, it's very easy for anybody to figure this out. But when it's under the, like you said, this sativa or indica, which is a terrible way of representing the thing, as far as, so what we did, and you can back me up on this, because when I spoke to some of the scientists from Mary's Medicinals. I went to Colorado, got toured through their facilities. I had a plug back then. Super nice people, but very much like you, very intelligent to what is actually happening. And they said when they first classified these plants, there was 3 different regions that they got them from. One was by the equator, okay? And at the equator, at sea level, we're talking about very good ground, but also very good air quality, right? And also, that thing is reaching as far as it can for the sun. So we had a little bit more stretched out of a plant. We just naturally lumped them all together, said that's a sativa. And then in the mountains where we found all of the indicas, right, like in Afghanistan and whatever, those were all grown in the mountains. That's less air quality, closer to the sun, don't need to reach as far. So they're a little bit more bushy, tight, chonkers, whatever. And we called them indicas. And then we found a plant up in the snow, up in Russia, and we went, hey, well, this is totally different than everything else that we see, but it's still cannabis. So well, it's ruderalis. And now that thing, so by that, we've gone, okay, well, there's the sativa plant, the indica plant, and the CBD plant. And it's like, but if you grew them in different regions and you stress them with different levels of nutrients or different levels of light or
Or
atmosphere or
oxygen.
whatever it is, that plant's going to respond completely differently and is not going to be heavily producing of the thing that you thought it was, as much as it now has to maybe produce more of this other resinous part of itself to protect it from that environment typically, right? So the plant might be very much so more the same than it is different, unless the environment's different, right? Am I
Yep.
wrong in saying something
No.
of that nature?
That's the
No,
one
I
thing that
think you
everybody's chasing is environmental variables and VPD if we're
So
talking about cannabis. That's the
bingo.
number one thing.
Well, so then if the plant is all just the same and it just produces different resinous parts to protect itself in different environments or whatever it is, maybe it's more true that the things from the equator will grow a limonene dominant profile, and maybe the things up in the mountains will grow a myrcene dominant profile or whatever it is. But to classify them then as couch, coma, the dumbest shits I've ever heard in my life, or sativa, this, it's
Get shit
uplifting,
done.
euphoric, energetic, whatever, which is fine. But there are extremes to this that actually exist. That when I'm looking at the things that you measured, probably many of times, because Rev was one of my favorite. You guys actually had some of the best lab results that I used to have access to at the beginning of cannabis. When I would compare them side by side, I'd go, what the fuck, man? How is it that this thing is more sativa than this thing, or this thing is more indica than that? Like, just in statistics alone, it seems kind of weird. But then also in one individual plant, and maybe you were around for this. Um, what the fuck one was it? It was uh turbo lemon cake. Turbo lemon cake, when
Oh
it
yeah,
first came
turbo
out,
lemon cake.
it was a sativa, okay, according to Revolution's packaging. And according to their test results, it had unbelievable, through the roof limonene content. Well, then the next batch of it came out, and the myrcene content went above that of the limonene. And like everybody was like, "Oh, it's indica." And Rev literally changed the packaging from sativa to indica to say that it was indica because
You
that
had
was
to
what
go
it
to
was.
purple.
And then they got another batch of it that came back with that high limonene content again. All right. So they literally went back and changed the packaging yet a third time. Now, they might have had enough from the first time to just go back to it, whatever. But I literally was like, what just happened? I just watched the wildest thing, and it's coming from one of the big players now. So, like, and I think that was it at the beginning was okay, just limonene's better. Limonene's higher, we'll just call it sativa. Myrcene's higher, we'll just call it an indica. And to have those as the lump sum of what sativa or indica is means is like drastically misrepresenting what this plant is actually capable of. And when the individual small parts of the plant get separated out, we tend to see them do a little bit different things, right? So, like, and they're playing in different parts of the endocannabinoid system. We've lumped all of CB1 as, because it's a receptor style, as this is just going to catch all THC, and all CB2, because it's a receptor style, is just going to catch all CBD. But we now are starting to find out beta
Yeah, it
caryophyllene.
antagonizes both.
Well,
Hmm.
bingo. But then also beta caryophyllene is on its own, it's binding to CB2 receptors without any catalyst of CBD or THC. So there are so many different parts of this plant that are potentially playing a role. Like for me as the end delivery, I've always said, like, I want this thing to be Burger King, right? Separate it out into everything individual and let people build it however they want. Have it your way, right? Because then there's no more like, well, I want the 60% TH. All that shit is garbage. Like, the ways that the packaging represents cannabis is so much less true in the representation of like what we feel.
Can we talk about
Yeah.
how cannabis is represented through testing in Illinois? Because I
Yeah,
know you have
100%.
I know you have some expertise in that as well.
Yeah, so, typically, it really first and most importantly is, what you're testing, right? So, you have to test the end product.
Hmm.
So, if you're testing a gummy, that's an entirely different sampling procedure and, testing procedure, right? Because it's, like, in this matrix of, like, sugar and, like, wax or pectin or whatever, right? Than just testing, like, a cart or flour,
Hmm.
right? So, at least as it relates to flour, typically what you're supposed to do is take off a cola. That cola is supposed to be representative of all your plants. Typically, I want to say, at least on the grow side, this isn't where I was really involved, but I want to at least touch on it. You have to take so many
Hmm.
for the size of the batch that you're doing,
Hmm.
right? So if you're doing like 2 rooms worth of the same genetics, then you have to take way more clippings to get a
Right.
representative sample of that whole lot of flour. Or
They're
if it's
only,
just like a tray, right?
if
That's a
I'm
different
not
story.
wrong, Alex, and I don't mean to interrupt you. You might know this and you might not. I think that at least in Illinois, a single batch can only be 20 pounds. I don't know if that's on the cultivation side or that's on the testing side, but I think I remember that being that number getting thrown out there in the past. And I don't know how much you're supposed to take from each one of them, but I remember arguing with a guy before. I was like, did you just give them the top colas and the best looking nugs or whatever, so that your tests would come back a certain way? Because if it's a 20-pound lot, right, we're talking about how many different plants from, I mean, the whole room could be, depending on what you're doing, like you could knock out a whole room with 20 pounds, right? So now you're like,
I could do that
so
in
the
10
the
plants.
plant all the way in the back
Look
is
at
the
this
same as
guy.
what's that?
I said I could
He's like,
do
"I
this.
do that in 10 plants."
Yeah, yeah.
It's 2 pounds of plant. That's nothing.
Yeah,
Yeah.
well, and that's what I'm saying, like, it's hard for me to believe that, like, one small sample of something is the true representation of the entirety of it, and
Yeah.
it's more that we should give it a range, right? Would it be more representative to give it a range? Would it be more true to the consumer if that was the case?
Yeah, so this is where the funny part is it felt a lot better on the hemp side. So when I was working for a hemp processor, we were principally making a lot of CBD. And what we would do on the testing side is like for every however many pounds, right? We would take clips, but we would send them specific instructions to say like it's got to be like the whole cola, you know what I mean? And then we would get a pound essentially of sample, right? And then we would macerate that up, grind it up into a representative sample, and then test it. Because the alternative would be having them basically generate their own samples in laboratory shop across all the different like independent ones, and then just get like the highest percentage because that would dictate how much we would pay for the lot. But then when you actually get it, it's not just the nugs, right? Like there's the whole stem and the fan leaves and stuff. And when you're talking about like hemp that's grown outdoors and cultivated at like large scale, we're talking acres and acres of the stuff. That stem may only constitute like 5% of the plant or something. Same thing with like the leaves or whatever. But when you're buying 10 or 20,000 pounds of this stuff, that 5 or 10% not being CBD makes a difference, right? And then when you're processing it at scale and so on and so forth, those sorts of things make a big difference. In the cannabis markets here in Illinois, I don't know that the flower results are really that questionable. Um, I would think, and it really just depends. And, we're talking about conjecture over sampling procedures like none of us have actually like seen going on at least. Um, but that withstanding, there are ways, right? So if you're just selectively taking just nugs off your plants or whatever, and then throwing that in a bag and getting it tested, like, yeah, you might actually hit 30 or 35%. But then you as the customer would smoke that and be like, but, I expected that to like punch a lot harder. And it did. I mean, I'm high, but like, it doesn't hit as hard. So there's certainly some things like that that could be going on.
We definitely have an
But like I said,
incentive
it's a
in
part that I haven't
Illinois.
done.
We definitely have an incentive in Illinois to have high THC product
Well,
because
that
they can
incentive
collect more
exists
tax.
everywhere.
Yeah, of course.
And there is a 15 I talk about it all the time. There is a 15% industry sway that is allowed. It's not a it's not like unknown. You can go look at it in the regulations, but it's that interpretation of what that 15% means. Because
And you
if
hit the nail on the head.
bingo, if the plant is 20% and you tell me now that it is 35%, holy shit, is that a drastic difference? How many people are going, oh, it's 20%? I'm just going to tell you it's 5%, right? Nobody's doing that. Comparatively to it's 20%, 15% off of that makes it 23%, right? That's doing real math on the number 20. But
Right.
if we're talking, well, we're talking it's a percentage to begin with. So if I just add 15% to that, what's this? So there is some interpretation of the word, the verbiage that um, we know for a fact gets played with. I'm not
Oh, 100%.
100%.
No, and certainly I will say that like the methodologies that the actual testing labs use, at least the licensed ones here in Illinois, because like there's cannabis labs that like don't get to participate in testing stuff that goes to the dispensary, but they can test stuff, right? And
Hmm.
they can test like hemp or fiber or whatever. There's like two distinct different labs that you can talk about. So at least as it relates to the cannabis ones, they do have to adhere to certain standards, like ISO 9001. So these are like industry standards that apply beyond just cannabis. For what it's worth, these are just like, hey, you're an analytical chemist and
Hmm.
you're testing, gunshot residue or chemicals or prescription drugs or whatever. That like how that testing machine works, how you log that data, how you interpret the actual results, because there's a little bit of creativity you can go into there if you wanted. But to eliminate all that and maintain the integrity of any analysis, there are standards that you have to adhere to, right? And like the baseline standards that you're comparing your samples to, are regulated in the same sort of way. NIST does a lot of that work. National Institute for shit, I lost it, but they do all sorts of things to define um, different chemical samples, measurements, and basically set
Standards
the
and
yardstick.
testing,
Yeah,
standards and
that's correct.
technology. Excuse me.
Yep. Yeah.
National Institute of Standards and Technology.
Which funny thing, I mean, like they do some really interesting stuff where like they have government peanut butter. Which sounds really weird, but they have, like, a standard of peanut butter, so that way you can test it for, like it's more for, like, mold contents and heavy metals and stuff like that, but that's basically like, they have the benchmark for pretty much anything you can think of. There's a whole department in there where they just keep all of these different standards, chemical standards, weights, measurements, different metals and alloys and stuff like that, so that's the sort of thing that these testing labs are really relying on, right? So at least for the ones that are operating in Illinois, that's how they operate. So their results are their results. There could be an argument that maybe there is some finagling, but I never really saw that. I saw it more in like the hemp side of things because you get very much some fly-by-night labs that say that they hold to those standards or whatever, but in practice, like there isn't some sort of state regulator that's coming in and actually auditing them in
It
that same way like a licensed testing lab in Illinois for recreational cannabis would be.
it only costs about $150 a year to become a tester in Illinois.
I just Yeah, it's just for what you are saying, and I'm not against, and I think there's a standard, and there's probably some integrity to whatever is going on out there. I just think that if you're being very above par with the making sure there's no contaminants in there, that you've probably as a chemist gone through all of the what you need to do to represent cannabis, right? Because as long as you make sure that it's safe for consumption, THC is just fucking THC, CBD is just who gives a shit? All of that's just going to be there. I wouldn't really care about the numbers as much as I would maybe let's make sure that the pesticides aren't there and the excess heavy metals and the whatever might be contaminating the thing or the mold and the whatever, and in again the regulation directly they're given limitations, and so long as everything meets the limitations and falls within their standards, no harm no foul. And I'm not, again, not throwing any of that under the bus as much as I'm like, please, by all, whoever's out there, whoever ends up listening to this, if you are a laboratory testing something, the number of THC molecules and the volume of THC per what it is drastically does matter. So like the adjusting of regardless of I think just do it with a level of integrity, but also yeah, I just chemically speaking, as long as we are um I don't know how to say it, not misrepresenting what is in the plant, I don't think you've done anything wrong, right? Like
Yeah.
it's right.
No,
But
and at least, as it relates to, like, the testing procedure, it's pretty sound, right, as far as, like, the cannabinoid content. It's called HPLC, high performance liquid chromatography, and essentially, it just separates out a complex package of different chemicals and then kinda strings them out, and then it goes through a little detector and then gets kinda zapped with a particular band of UV light, and then based on how much it, like, essentially shines back or reflects,
What isn't
um
there?
what's that?
What isn't there?
Or
Then
is, you're
or
right.
is, right.
is that based
Um,
Alex, then is that based off of the volume of the entire plant, the nugget that they get, all the flour material and everything that's in there? So when we say 35% THC, we mean the entire 1 gram of the plant that is sitting there. 35% of that by weight is THC? Correct,
mhm.
right?
Dry weight, yeah, typically
Mhm.
is how it's represented, because moisture is, turns out water is actually pretty heavy.
Yep.
So typically that's done on a dry weight basis. Same is true for like terpenes and stuff like that. But also bear in mind, right, that like in reality though, like that distribution of the cannabinoid isn't even. So like it's very obvious that like the stem that's in there doesn't have, you know, any cannabinoids in it, and then like your trichomes on the outside have a lot. But we're not going to tell you like the trikes are specifically tested to, it's not practical to do it that way. So you typically just take a representative sample, chop it up, test it, and then, all right, so if you buy a pound of this stuff, it's going to be this percentage. And then you can at least subtract out and say, like, okay, I'm getting this many milligrams of cannabinoids or whatever if I smoke this entire thing tip to butt, nug to stem.
Yeah, bingo. Yeah, and I think there's a lot of people who believe that there is a different strength of THC. Like that, like it is not a representation of volume by the plant as much as it is in alcohol. The stronger the proof you get of it, the more potent something is immediately and upfront, right? Where people
Yeah.
don't understand that if you consume 1 gram of 35% THC, or 30% THC, and you consume 2 grams of 15% THC, like you've had the same amount, and it's going to be the same. It should be theoretically the same efficacy if it's just THC direct.
Well, the big thing there, and this kind of ties back to something you were talking about earlier, is so like method of delivery matters. So yeah, in alcohol, since it's all liquid and you're all drinking it, gets digested, processed by the liver, and then you pee it out. Yeah, higher proof, it's going to get you more fucked up more quickly. Um, but for cannabis, not every milligram is necessarily the same when you consider that drinking it when it's nanoemulsified is going to get metabolized by your body differently than if you're vaping it or putting it on your skin and doing like some sort of dermal application and so on and so forth, right? So, how you consume that really matters. And then another how in that, to the sativa and indica element of it, right? So, if you're at a party and there's a bunch of music playing and people are talking and having a good time, right? It's kind of bright. Maybe you're out in the sun or on the beach or whatever. If you smoke a joint, you're probably just gonna like be uplifted, right? It's not gonna matter so much like what the distribution of all these like minor terpenes and cannabinoids are in it. But if you're sitting in a dark room alone, maybe you're listening to like quiet somber music and you consume some cannabis in any which way, then you're probably going to get sleepy,
Yep.
right? And if I made that argument for alcohol, right, you wouldn't bat an eye. So if you're sitting alone in the dark drinking by yourself, you're probably going to fall asleep,
Yep.
right? Especially if you're getting drunk. But if you're like at a party with a bunch of people and you drink the same amount of alcohol, but there's like music and all that stuff going on, you're gonna be like, hell yeah, and
Yeah.
dancing and whatever. So I think that has more of an impact on like how you actually perceive and feel the high of a cannabis like intake than what the product is necessarily. The caveat that being obviously if you smoke it, it's very instantaneous,
Mhm.
kind of like alcohol, right? You get it pretty quick.
Mhm.
You can feel the effects within like 30 minutes to an hour, depending on your
Well,
metabolism. But if you take a gummy, um, shit, all bets are off, right?
well, and that's the
Um,
whole thing. Like the measurability of ingestion rate is very true, right? Inhalation, because of how it hits our lungs, goes through the alveoli and the bronchi, and then distributed through the blood, and our blood circulates through our system in 5 minutes, right? So that
Yeah, but you
lung,
also have it spike immediately too, because it goes directly into your blood and then goes to your brain. But when you take it as an edible, essentially it like leaks
yep,
into your blood very slowly, and so then like the way you perceive that, right, is it's just a steady, steady creep, right? So it's lower intensity, longer duration,
yep,
like milligram for milligram, versus smoking where it's like very short duration, relatively speaking, but it's very high intensity because it comes at all at once immediately and it's immediately bioavailable. Granted, there are things you can do with edibles like nanoemulsification that can greatly speed up the rate at which your body can interface with it. So, like your body just generally isn't very good at processing oil. That's why like hydrogenated corn syrup and soybean oil and all that sort of stuff is like bad for you, right?
Hmm.
And then it generally leads to you kind of just getting fat or bloated or inflamed or whatever. Um,
And
and the same is
craving
true for
more of it.
cannabis. Well, that too, but that's a whole separate discussion. Um, but as far as cannabis is concerned, right? Essentially, you can add this product, and essentially what that does is you can kind of think of like your body, chemically speaking, in a variety of different ways, having like glove or lock and key components. So your body is mostly water, so it mostly interfaces in that kind of water side of the chemical house, right? Whereas if you bring things that are oily, like they can interface, but it's kind of like weak magnets trying to lock together versus like some neodymium stuff where they like snap together. It's like impossible to pull them
Hmm.
apart. So you can essentially add some compounds, which are generally regarded as safe. So it's not like we're talking about you're consuming a bunch of this stuff every day anyway, right? Um, but you can add some of these compounds, and they basically allow you to make it miscible in water, which is really helpful on the drink side of house. So that's why you've seen like the exploding popularity of cannabis drinks because people figured that out. But then likewise, it also if you put it into an edible like a goober or something or a gummy or something, that allows your body to actually interface with it a lot more readily, so you feel the effects a lot more quickly. Granted, still slower than just smoking or vaping it, but it's a lot faster than just taking a gummy without any of these compounds in it and then just having your body try to digest oil.
And that's bingo
That's
too.
awesome.
Digestion rate individually plays a big factor in this as well, where I've seen, again, I've seen very large men, big burly for whatever, that take 5 milligrams and are crying in the corner because it was too much. And then I see these 100-year-old ladies that are like frail and little and brittle, and they're eating
And they just
500
tank it.
milligrams,
Yeah.
and they're like,
Yeah.
This is shit. It ain't doing it for,"
Yeah.
I think it's like
Yeah.
method of delivery too. And I literally just had a conversation an hour before I showed up here with a older gentleman. Um, them damn gummies don't do it for me. Them damn blah blah blah. He said, but I just went and ate some of that RSO and yeah, whatever. I said, yeah, exactly. Because like, and he said, well, I made it into what you call it, Rice Krispies.
Yeah.
And he said, I just put it in with the butter. I said, okay, well, here's the thing though, too, like gelatin and whatever, comparatively to like butter, which is more of a natural source of fat, which our body's actually good at absorbing through and whatever too. If I'm not wrong, or if I'm wrong, you tell me that too. But I believe that the butter has a better chance of your body absorbing it than the gelatins or whatever. So maybe you just had a better onset, whatever. And I said, but better yet, why don't you try this new drink that we have? Because it is, again, nano emulsified. You have a better chance of it actually absorbing and getting to the point where you want it to intertwine or interact with your body. Right. So,
Well, I will say too on the front with RSO, so it wasn't so readily apparent when I was at Rev, because principally I was just like the logistics guy, right? Just like in the military, the one dude in front has 18 guys behind him,
Hmm.
actually like bringing him the food and the ammo and all that sort of stuff. So certainly I was one of those 18 guys in the back. I never really interfaced with customers, with the exception being I was at a bar in Bloomington. This is like years ago, and I'm sitting out back having a cigarette, um, and I noticed these 2, like, college kids, and they're, like, getting a nectar collector, right? And they pull out this little container, so I, like, come over there and I'm like, "Oh, you guys are" like, I just started working in, like, the cannabis industry, so I'm like, "Whoa," this is crazy. And we just start talking about pot for a while, and then it turns out he actually had some Rev, blueberry and clementine sauce,
oh,
and I was like, "Dude, I fucking made that." Ended up, like, looking at the lot number, I'm like, "Yeah, dude, I made that, like, so many weeks ago," or whatever, right? So then he offered me a dab.
That's
It
that's
was
awesome.
really, really
awesome.
cool. But that being said, I generally didn't. So we were doing a lot of RSO back then. I will give Rev a lot of credit because they were one of the few companies that I recall back then doing the ratios. So, rather than just selling you straight CBD or straight THC RSO, we would take the time to blend it.
Mhm.
And that was one of the big projects because they had purchased this like HPLC unit, and it was like $500,000. very nice piece of equipment, but the last chemist they had basically just skedaddled, never set it up. So they just invest that, and then they had a Shimatsu GCMS, which is how you would do like the terpenes or heavy metals and stuff like that. And that one was pretty expensive too. And they were basically giant paperweights. So I have, from my schooling, I went to U of I, did a chemistry degree, and I did organic and analytical. So think like making stuff and then making sure that you made the stuff you thought you made. That was kind of the logic I had going through the courses. Um, but what we ended up doing is firing that HPLC online, and then the idea is like testing at a licensed laboratory is very expensive, right? So like the cost of failure is very, very high, if not for the direct monetary cost, but for the fact that then this product has to go into quarantine. You have to do whatever to remediate it or unfuck it, and then you have to retest it. The testing lab only comes by like once a week. It's kind of like anything else, right? If I can come and stop once a week, I got to pay the driver's time to come out, make sure you do the samples right, bring them back, and so on and so forth. So, like, you have to wait all that time as well, which means that lot doesn't hit, an ability to be packaged and then sold to a dispensary, so that they could realize the revenue from all the investment they've put into growing the plant, paying me to process it, getting it packaged and sold, right? Um, so we would end up using this HPLC system for a fraction of the cost, and basically we would blend, our pure THC RSO stock and our CBD RSO stock, and then we would test it to confirm that, like, yeah, we're at that 10-to-1 ratio, or if we're not, how much of this or that do I need to add to get it there, right? So those were the sorts of things that I was working on. But the RSO is fantastic. And I even saw this when I was at Mia Processing, which has since closed down. Um, but essentially, we had a lot of different like investor guys that would come through, right? And obviously, the people who casually have like $250,000 or $500,000 to invest in like your rinky-dink operation, so you can go buy X equipment or hire Y guy or whatever. They're all generally kind of old. Who would have thought?
Hmm.
And so a lot of them, do have Parkinson's, IBS, arthritis, cancer, and if not them directly, then like their spouse or like some immediate family member of theirs. And so naturally, they would come by and see how everything's doing, and then they would want like a little bit of this or a little bit of that. Um, and like, obviously, people like had a lot of success with like the carts. People had a lot of success with the gummies, but like the two biggest things that actually seemed to have like the greatest practical effect for almost anyone we gave it to was a salve, which I think I still have. Yeah, I even still use it. I took a box of them, but it's basically just like this cream, right? It's like a balm, so you can literally just
Hmm.
rub it with your finger and then put it wherever you want. So for people who had like arthritis and stuff like that, it was really, really helpful for like their hands. And then for people who were dealing with the cancer side of house, um, the RSO was really good. And so that ended up becoming like this like fascination of mine. Um, because like in any other instance, you kind of think like, I don't want like diluted aspirin, right? Like, I
Right.
want a bunch of aspirin if I have a headache. I don't wanna put a bunch of other shit in it. If I have a fever, I want acetaminophen. I don't want a diluted form
Yep.
of acetaminophen. You want this, like, pure concentrated thing at, like, a right dose. So, like, why is it the case that, like, I would be giving, some of these investors or customers or whatever, like, CBD isolate, in, like, a gummy form or something like that, and then it was like, yeah, I feel the wellness coursing through my body, but it's not like anything like super duper remarkable. But then you'd give people like RSO, that was principally CBD, right? So it's not like they're getting high and they're just like, yeah, man, I feel so good. Like they would feel like amazing. The
Promise
the
you.
the flag, yeah, the flagship one I remember, and obviously like just for discretion, I'm not going to name names, but this particular gentleman, was a retired like SWAT guy. I think he was a sniper. And he had, I want to say, like stage 3 or stage 4 liver cancer. Like, by all accounts, basically, like
Yeah.
a fucking death sentence, right? And he was a friend of a particular investor we had. Um, but in this particular case, he was actually willing to be transparent. So he had a number of different tests that were performed, looking at like biomarkers that would make some sort of indication to say that like you have super cancer and it's going everywhere. Or like, oh, it's kind of diminishing. Anyone who's had anyone go through some sort of cancer chemotherapy would be somewhat familiar with that. So there were these particular biomarkers that they were looking at that essentially measured like the intensity of his cancer, right? How severe is it getting? Is it like in remission, and so on and so forth. So he had, a series of these done, which were kind of run of the mill. You're doing chemotherapy, so it's like the medical equivalent of beating the fleas off a dog with a stick, right? You're just kind of carpet bombing everything. Um, and then he started taking the RSO, and this was all just hemp derived CBD. I
Hmm.
think you're like a 2% THC or whatever. It's like some marginal amount. And then by all accounts, like the terpenes aren't anything to like write home about. It's like CBD flower. It's not exactly, obviously genetics have changed since a few years ago. So there are some CBD flowers that like smell fucking fantastic. But for the most part, all this shit's grown out in like farm country, kind of smells like hay.
Hmm.
You know, it's not anything to write home about. Um, if anything, it's kind of, if you put it into a vape and just do straight the CBD flower hemp terps,
Yeah.
real throat closer. But then he started taking this product, and then over the course of like several months, his biomarkers, in conjunction with like normal treatment, right? So he didn't like just skip out on chemotherapy, started to decline, which would be indicative that he was actually getting better and his cancer was going into remission. And he himself is kind of skeptical, like I am, right? So he actually stopped taking it. And then in the preceding couple months, his biomarkers started to elevate again, which would suggest that the cancer was getting worse again. Then he gets back on it, and then they start dropping again. Now, I'm not a medical doctor. I don't do cancer stuff like that. Obviously, I kind of know where my lanes are. But certainly, like at an anecdotal level, I was like, all right, this shit's fucking weird. You
Hmm.
know. And so
It's
since then, there's a lot of literature out there that have kind of looked at it. Um, and obviously nothing definitive has come out. Otherwise, we would all kind of know because like we're all the sorts of people who would be like, "Whoa, that's fucking insane." Um, but all that withstanding, it basically seems to be the idea that like, um, and I guess I should step back here. So like you get flour, and that is a mix of like water. There's all these different sugars, right? The leaves in any plant
hmm
generally have like this wax that make them waterproof or whatever. So you get all these different planty waxes and stuff like that. Um,
lipids.
Correct.
Yeah.
And then obviously you have your cannabinoids, your terpenes and stuff like that. So there's this poop soup of stuff in there. So when you do an ethanol extraction, you basically get like this black tar, and that's like your crude or your RSO, right? At least once you've pulled off the ethanol,
Hmm.
right, and it's been degassed and stuff like that and decarbed. Um, and so that then gets put into distillation. So essentially, what you're doing in the distillation process is having all those like waxes and those sugars, and like the any sort of moisture that's left in your flour and stuff like that, all essentially stays like on this wall and drips down into like one container that gets referred to as waste. Essentially, there's really no use for it, although there should be. But I digress. And then essentially all your money or your gold,
Hmm.
right, all your cannabinoids will actually come off the wall, and then kind of like a cold beer can on a hot humid summer day, like all of that moisture in the air starts to collect on the can and it like drips down, right? You essentially have the same idea inside of your still, and then you have this rod that all of that distillate you just made with cannabinoids and stuff collects on and drips down, and that goes into a separate container. And so you can kind of think of it like if you're burning flour in your bowl, right?
Hmm.
All of that resin and wax is essentially what you would get if you do it in distillation. The difference is when I heat it in a still, I'm like pushing it somewhere else, collecting it into a container. Whereas when you're smoking it in your bowl, right, that essentially goes into your lungs and the resin stays in your bowl.
Hmm.
But it's the same idea. But the thing is everybody's super fixated on the cannabinoids, on the terpenes, and like what are the little distributions of like this to that, and what ratio. And like there is some merit to that, obviously, as we all know. But there's also something to be said. Like it's kind of like tunnel vision. We're so focused on this particular thing that we forget that it's just like a plant.
Hmm.
And like maybe some of these sugars that are in the plant are kind of relevant. Maybe some of these waxes aid like the uptake of like these certain compounds, and that all gets like lumped together into the entourage effect. But that's really just a catch-all phrase to say we don't fucking know, you know.
Yep.
Um, but of course, that's not like the sexy thing to investigate, right? Everybody wants to look at like the different cannabinoids, and look at all the different terpenes and play with those ratios. But like, it's much harder to look at like these sugars or waxes and try to figure out, right? Like, what do we do with this, or how do we control those and dose them? But I feel like, personally, in my opinion, that's kind of what aids RSO in being as effective as it actually is in comparison to like more like pure elements of CBD or THC or CBN or whatever.
I beg people always when they're especially directly trying to treat cancer, to get as many different aspects of the plant inside of them as they can, but also to be more cognizant that, like, if you are to look at it scientifically, according to Israel, right? Because that's where most of the good information comes from,
Oh,
right?
huge amount of literature out of there.
Bingo. We've got some badasses who have directly and separated individual cannabinoids or terpenoids and thrown them into rats and stuff that have had cancers and tried to see what different things respond to different things. So there's a lot of good information, I think, over there. Again, none as definitive to go, yes, CBN is the one that deals with breast cancer. But then we're also trying to pretend that, like, everything is always the same, right? Like, it is CBN no matter what, but cancer is not cancer, right? Like, even to
Yeah, and
say,
the way it manifests and what it's affecting
but
is a huge fucking difference.
and even then, when we lump them into certain categories and we say, okay, that's brain cancer or whatever, we go, okay, well, what part of the brain and how is that being affected? Or it's like leukemia. How many different types of leukemia are there? Right? There's different forms of what each one of those is. So to pretend that, okay, well, CBN is, it works for all, breast cancer, and I got breast cancer, I better take only CBN, is to, again, like you said, to be so narrow in your approach to it, where, like, I've said for a long time, I think cannabis is the honeybee of plants, right? Where honeybees are just, and everybody says, okay, eat the honey from your local region because it's going to give you all those little different pollens or whatever from your natural area, and it'll help build an immunity for yourself. I so too think that a lot of times the environment that that plant is in is absorbing all of whatever is going on around it to protect it from all of that. Well, you sit in the same place that that plant does. So maybe, like you said, some of the lipids, some of the sugar, some of the whatever might be as beneficial as the rest of the plant. But that's why I think some of the, and I fully back you in what you said. I think I think gummies are it's a market. It's a way to make people buy shit. It's not the true efficacy of this plant by the end of it. It's not the thing that's going to anatomically or physiologically help somebody progress, especially through a condition like cancer or whatever, as much as, like, where I've always said, like, okay, there's a really good CBD dominant RSO. It's from Shelby County. It's called Sweet Pea. I have been
Okay.
from the beginning of the market begging people to consider, on top of whatever else you're trying, add some of this sweet pea in there. Their RSOs from Shelby are phenomenal. They're really nicely refined. Um, and so anyway, um, they also are very ratioed out and stuff. But this CBD dominant thing has a lot of, I want to say it's like osamine, which when I was at the beginning was like another
Yeah, that's a rare one.
anti-tumoral, whatever. There was a few of these, like, anti-tumoral, anti-cancerous, right? Like CBD says anti-cancerous, anti-tumoral on it. When you look at it in every setting of the word, right, you're like, okay, that says those two things on it. THC does not claim to be anti-tumoral, anti-cancerous, as much as we have gone, because of Rick Simpson, we've gone hammer down that thing, let it kill the whatever's going on, and we're like, okay, we don't even know if that's the truth of any of this shit. To let alone go, okay, well, it's the big heavy thing in the plant, so okay, just throw that at everybody, and that's got to be what's going on.
Well,
Um,
the big thing I wanted to piggyback off that is, like, to play devil's advocate, though, we want it. I've invested close to a decade of my life, like, in the space. So, like, obviously, I want the cannabis stuff to be, like, the answer. But, a pretty simple thing I would add to all of that is the fact that, like, generally, what is someone dealing with when they're going through, like, chemotherapy, right? They generally lose their appetite,
Bingo.
right?
We're symptom
They
alleviation, brother. I'll back you
Yeah,
1,000%.
100%.
There's only two
And
conditions.
if all I wanted to say on that fact is, like, if you're not sleeping, you're not eating, and you're not really drinking, like, you're gonna have a bad time even if you're otherwise healthy.
Bingo.
Like, when you go to the hospital, what is the first fucking thing they do? They bag you, right? They give you saline because most shit is because you're not drinking enough water, right? Um, but likewise, like, if you're going through chemotherapy and you're not sleeping regularly, you're not eating regularly, you're not exercising regularly, and so on and so forth. Well, if you're taking cannabis and it gets all of those blockers out of the way, and then you're otherwise now eating healthy, and now sleeping, and so on and so forth, like, the effectiveness of that treatment is going to be way better. And maybe the cannabis doesn't really have too much to do with, like, the actual, like, knocking the cancer back so much as it's just allowing the traditional therapy to actually work. I do think, like, the truth is somewhere in the middle, right? Because it very obviously, like, in these controlled environments, there are certain terpenoids, certain monoterpenes, and certain cannabinoids that have demonstrated in very isolated and controlled settings to have these anti-tumor effects. Um, but obviously, the devil's in the details, and what works in a laboratory in a small, very controlled condition versus what actually works practically are two very different things.
I couldn't agree more with you, brother. Um, yeah, I had a point to that, and I need to smoke something to get my brain kicked back. Uh, no, what the hell was I gonna say? Um, fuck if I can remember.
There was this other point, while you were speaking about, like, the different,
Oh,
like, regs that from a testing point of view need to be met. So I remember back at Rev, and these numbers may have changed because I've since, like, left the regulated THC space and opted to the hemp side of house, which we can talk about too. Um, but, like, I noticed that, like, for example, like, the residual solvents. So, essentially, solvents, sounds like a chemistry word, very dirty, you don't want it, but, like, water's a fucking solvent.
yep,
You know what I mean?
yep.
Mhm.
Um,
CO2 we breathe out of our
so
mouth. Yep.
Exactly. Um, so all it basically is just like, look, in the pharmaceutical industry or anything else, when you're making drugs, the reality is you can't handle these things directly, right? So you essentially use a solvent like a sponge to suck up certain classes of chemicals, right?
Mhm.
The most obvious distinction being, at a technical level, polar versus nonpolar. Nonpolar, think oil. Polar, think like water, right? That's why oil and water don't mix.
Mhm.
Um, so, in pharmaceutical manufacturing for like boner pills or Advil or whatever, you generally have to use these things. Some syntheses or some compounds require more harsh solvents that, like, if you ingested them is a bad time. Others you can just use like water or something innocuous, or ethanol, right? Everybody kind of
Mhm.
drinks recreationally, so if there's a little bit of in your pill, it's not the end of the world. Um, but obviously, you can imagine that there were some people that pushed the envelope years and years and years ago. So they made regs to say, like, hey, you can only have so much of X, Y, or Z. Uh, the FDA typically regulates it, and there's like three classes that then impose like different ranges on these three different classes of what's acceptable or permissible in a food or pharmaceutical or nutraceutical product. Um, but when you look through the regs at Illinois, they're actually like the most extreme,
Oh, by far.
So
right?
here's my
Um,
question. Here's my question. So with the regs that we have in Illinois for testing and mold content and whatnot, I hear lots of people say, well, you go to Michigan, it's 500 times this, 500 times that, whatever. But does that actually make for a better product?
Yeah, that's a good point. I'm not intimately familiar with Michigan's particular accepted levels of
Hmm.
different residual solvents.
I
But
believe
generally,
we're 5
if they
parts
adhere
per
to
million.
FDA guidelines, then what's
You
that?
you might be here. We're 5 parts per million butane, right?
Mhm.
I think that Michigan might
Or
be
I think it's 10, something like that.
right, okay, and I think that Michigan I think we're 5 and they might be 50, or we're 10 and they might be 100, whatever the math is there, but I'm almost sure that they base their market off of OSHA standards for what you could work inside of. If you were, like, in a
Yeah,
facility
for
that
consistent
had
prolonged exposure. Yeah.
right. If you were in a facility that had 8 to 10 hours of a work job and you were exposed to 100 parts per million butane, you're fine by OSHA standards. And then they just use that as an arbitrary number and said, fine, as long as it's less than that, then you can't be consuming an amount that would hurt you. Um,
Yeah, and that's partially because, like, policymakers don't wanna come forward and be perceived as lax, right? So certainly it's obvious that if I'm like, "Hey, these standards are really strict, we should raise the amount of mold or or lead or whatever that's permissible in your product," like, that on the surface sounds terrible, and if you're talking about a politician who's writing legislation, there's always that person that can be like, "Oh, well, you can be safer, you can be safer." And that isn't to say that there isn't any merit to that argument, but you have to kind of marry practicality to like safety and find the blend somewhere in the middle. And I certainly will tell you that it is a pain in the fucking ass, especially back then. Obviously, new technologies and methods of doing things have come out because obviously industry is not going to just lay there and fail every fucking test.
Right.
They got to sell stuff.
yeah.
But certainly it was a pain in the ass and it imposed a pretty big cost. And then you kind of have to ask yourself the question, like, well, what purpose does it like really serve? Um, so that being said, I know I'm taking like the really weird position there where it's like we should make it shittier, you know.
No,
But
but
in
I'm with
essence, as long as you're keeping it in line
Yeah.
with what you would otherwise expect from your doctor, right? I feel like that's okay, but trying to I guess not undercut, but you know what I mean, right? To lower those standards even
Yeah.
more such that like you have to be at like 10 parts per fucking million.
Right.
Um, in the spirit of like sounding like you're doing something better, that's kind of nice, but it doesn't make any real practical difference, right?
no, and it
You're
forces remediation, right?
Yep.
yeah,
It
Yeah.
forces you to yeah,
Well,
and through remediation, and you can maybe help everybody who might not understand what remediation means on a technical level, or what you're doing to remediate. Um, that might
yeah,
help. Yeah,
I can go into that.
yeah.
So remediation is a broad thing, right?
hmm
So what are you remediating? If you're dealing with heavy metal contents, that's going to be like one flavor of problem to crack versus if you're dealing with something like mold,
hmm
where you have like this organism that you're trying to kill, and then a physical thing that you're also trying to remove. Um, so generally, I didn't dabble too much with flour for, and this is more the business half. But essentially, like if I have flour that doesn't pass, it's kind of a bitch and a half to clean up the flour and still keep it as flour, right? You have to fundamentally do something to it,
Right.
and that's generally going to change it because you're not going to pull just the heavy metals or something like that, right? There's limitations on what you can practically and cost efficiently do. So generally, if you're talking about flour, let's say, for the sake of an example, it's contaminated with heavy metals, right? Then I would be apt to just extract it with ethanol and then take it to distillation because those heavy metals are literally not going to, like that analogy I gave you earlier, where you have like this wall that's heated. Those heavy metals aren't going to boil off, right? They're going to slide down into my waste fraction,
Yep.
and then essentially you've remediated it. The heavy metal's gone,
Bingo.
and now it's a product fit for sale. Um, if you're dealing with something more like mold, you can do the same thing with distillation, right? Do the ethanol extraction, do that. But then you also have another avenue where you can do BHO. And essentially, you can just blast that with BHO. Turns out propane and butane doesn't make for a great environment for living organisms. So that basically gets nuked. And then you would filter your resultant product out. And then you've got a resin or cured resin or shatter or whatever the
hmm
hell you want that's missing all those materials. You can also do heavy metal remediation through BHO. Um, but then that involves like putting in essentially like a filter that's filled with like sediment, So there's all these different clays, and this kind of gets into color remediation too. It's the same process. But essentially, these clays, like at a molecular level, have like an incredulous amount of surface area in them. So you can think of them as like these big fucking like almost like the sticky mats you use to catch rats.
Mhm.
And then they're chemically selective. Back to like that glove analogy, they have an affinity to bond to certain type of compounds or elements or anything like that. So then as you essentially pass your butane that's laden with your cannabinoids, terpenes, heavy metals, or mold or whatever, they selectively latch on to these different clays, and then your stuff passes through minus all that stuff. Essentially, the color remediation stuff is the same idea. So you have these different clays or medias that you're running this material through, and it selectively grabs these different pigments or oxidized products that are in your, your solvent stream,
Mhm.
and then when your stuff comes out, it's missing all that material. And the whole color remediation thing was kind of funny because we hit a point, this was at Rev, and then we messed with this a little bit at the hemp place that I worked, where like we could get that shit to be clear. It
Mhm.
looked like water.
Mhm.
But then the funny thing is we would start to get customers who didn't like it.
Mhm.
And you would think like if you're thinking like a chemist, and this was before I really started to develop more of like the business acumen half of it or the marketing half. But you would think like it's like the purest fucking product. There's
Right.
nothing in it. There's no colorants. It's just basically your oil and terpenes and stuff. So why would you think it's worse? And they're like, it looks like a drug. Like, dude, you're smoking pot. It is a drug, right?
Yeah.
But it doesn't have like that like kind of warm feeling to it, right? It just feels like this synthetic thing, even though I pulled it from a plant, right? And I just treated the fuck out of it. Um, but then consequently, you can do nothing to it, and then it basically comes out like black tar. And if I sold you a vape that looked brown or black, you'd be like, dude, this is fucking disgusting. And it's like I did minimal treatment on it,
Lorano has a
right?
whole line based on that.
Yeah.
What of
It's
dark
called On the
carts?
Rocks.
Oh yeah.
Oh,
Hell
the for
no.
clear stuff?
It's
Yeah.
dark.
Yeah.
It's dark. It's like coffee dark.
Yep.
Yeah, and again, this is like these are the sorts of things that kind of lead to confusion in the market because I can tell you straight away, and I'm guessing here, but like they did a run of material. They sunk X amount of dollars into it between like payroll, material costs, reagent costs, equipment time, any dimension of analysis you want to put on there, right? They put enough money into it. Shit's still dark. Somebody messed up, or maybe no one messed up, and it's just boof product that
Mhm.
like the growers, messed up, whatever excuse you want to throw under the sun. But now you have all this shit, right? And if you don't sell it, what are you going to take a loss? Like in this economy? No way.
Right.
So, well, what do? There's not anything technically we can do to it. So the marketing department comes up and goes, how do we convince people to accept this? Oh, well, no, it's not. It's not a product that's out of conformance. It's a new product. It's on the rocks.
Yeah.
It's
Yeah.
cool, right?
Yeah.
And that's a lot of the shit that goes into the same thing with the sativa and indica stuff, right?
Yep.
They want to sell a mood or something, and even though there's no technical bearing on much of any of it, um, it's like where marketing. It's where the truth
Yeah.
and reality
We're
and
selling
fiction go to
feelings.
dance.
Yeah, we're selling
Yeah,
feelings.
right,
We're
Yeah.
selling
right. And the thing is, it works.
yeah.
It does, right? We may not like that, but like your average consumer, and I feel like this is the part that gets left out of a lot of conversations, is we always talk about like education, and stuff like that. Um, and we're like headies. You run a podcast about this stuff, right? I've been working in the space in all sorts of dimensions for like almost 10 years, like 8
Mhm.
years. So like yeah, we want to get into like the weeds
Yeah.
on everything. But like your average person, like my father-in-law who just wants to get a package of gummies
Mhm.
and then take one and watch fat people falling downstairs on YouTube while he's getting toasted.
Mhm.
He doesn't give a shit about the endocannabinoid system or CB1
Right.
or CB2. And if you hit him with that at the dispensary,
Done.
his eyes are going to gloss over.
Yep.
He don't give a shit, dude. He just wants the one that makes him chill out,
I
right?
witness this every day where there is some folk there's a proper level of delivery at a dispensary for what's going on, right? But you also like it's knowing a little bit of everything about. You need to know a little bit about the plant. You need to know a little bit about the laws. You need to know a little bit about your product individually. And then you kind of need to know a little bit about the person standing across from you. And there's this really nice, beautiful dance that goes on. But there is a very honest thing about this. Your methods of ingestion, the cannabinoids that you're going to consume and the terpenes that you're going to have,
Mhm.
they've been broken down very easily for us. Are you going to smoke, eat, apply topically, keep it in your mouth, whatever? Like, that's very easy. Do you want fucking THC, CBD, CBN, or what? There's not really much else that people are giving
Right.
you access to. Thank God now the market, we're seeing a little more CBC, a little more CBG, a little more THCV. There's access to different cannabinoids. And where I also too am like, okay, let's I'm with you. Let's break the barriers of all these dumb things because the whole plant has something more to offer to you than these individual aspects. Give me the raw individual aspect of it, because the moment that I give somebody raw crystalline THCA, right? That you can go home and dab it or whatever, and you smoke raw THC, you are going to be so fucking disappointed in what you just experienced.
Mhm.
You are going to look at all of us and go, wait, 100% didn't do it for me? No. It's not that great of a thing on its own. It's because of all of these other aspects that are involved in it. But if I smoke a fat dab of just plain THC, I can feel what I feel. I know what's
Yeah.
true to me, at least. And okay, so that's true of me with THC. Now you give me CBD and I can do the same thing. I could go through the process by myself, but that's why, like, I'm also like, that's a lot, bro. And if your father-in-law or whatever you said comes through, it's like, I don't fucking want that. Give me the basics and the easy part of this.
Yeah, just put it together into a package for me,
And
Mhm.
right?
and it kind
Um, and to and to your point, right, I like to use alcohol as an analogy. Go drink Everclear. It's 200 proof. It's 100% ethanol, maybe like
yeah, yeah,
99.999%, but it's doggy doo-doo, right?
yep,
It's a totally different experience than drinking wine that has all these different tannins and sulfites and sugars and stuff in it, and that in and of itself is a totally different experience than drinking a good bourbon,
yep,
right? Which is also a totally different experience than drinking a beer,
yep,
right? But, like, people get locked into, like, these, like, mental paradigms because, cannabis is, like, this thing where people have, like, these preconceived notions of how it's supposed to be or how you're supposed to feel. And certainly companies don't help because they're trying to like sell these feelings. But that in of itself is fundamentally like subjective, right?
Mhm.
Um, and so that's where you kind of have to just try it. I've had the luxury to be able to try all sorts of. I have tried HHC, I've tried Delta 8, CBC, CBG, CBN, D9, D10, THCO, CBD, like but I also like I'm not the normal person, right? Because like I'm dealing with other manufacturers or other businesses that are doing these sorts of things. I'm investigating how to convert all these different cannabinoids and stuff like that. So like I have that wealth of experience, but like the average person doesn't. And quite frankly, even if you offered it to the average person doesn't give enough of a shit to try all of that. They don't want to, right? They just want to know that this thing works. Just like if I go and reach into my fridge, grab a Coors Banquet, that it's beer and it's gonna taste good, right? I don't wanna, like, go and brew my own, although you're always going to have a subset of people who are like, "I wanna brew at home," right? "I
Mhm.
wanna make my own beer," just like you have with cannabis that are like, "I wanna do my home grow," right? And if that's your thing, then I would encourage you to do it,
Mhm.
right? But the average person walking into a dispensary is not that guy,
well,
right? It really isn't. It's like a 40-year-old woman who just wants a cart so they can put it in their purse and then be discreet when they vape. I think that's, like, the average customer, right? By retail sales.
yeah, yeah. You nailed it on the head. And I more people use this as their general everyday fuck it all than they do as a direct alleviant of even a symptom, right? Which for me, when I talk about this, I think cannabis, and it kind of goes back to what we were saying before, is purely it's a symptom alleviant, right? So when cancer patients are dealing with whatever comes from cancer, a lot of the times it's very, I'm not sleeping well, my appetite's dog shit, my energy production's dog shit, right? Like I'm just always down. But this cannabis thing comes in and regulates some of those things and helps me get through it. But it's mostly symptom alleviation, right? Where we also then that's we use cancer as it's a bad thing because there's two conditions that maybe we can directly treat according to what I've ever witnessed out there, right? One of them
Yeah,
is
likewise.
cancer, and the other one is epilepsy, right? Like it's
Yeah, that's
drastic.
another big one I didn't even touch on, but yeah.
Oh, it's drastic what this thing is capable of for the people who have access to those things. And to me, it's like, okay, I don't even care if I have a direct science necessarily, because it tends to be this plant has more than a directness to it. It's more of a roundness. There's more of a little bit of this and a little bit of that goes a very long way. And for you to come in and say like father-in-law, it's like whatever. When I tell my employees, I'm like, guys, you're never, I promise you, you're never going to sell somebody the wrong thing, because it's just fucking cannabis at the end of the day, right?
Hmm.
And even then,
Yes, and that is the huge thing that people forget because, like, you have all these different, like, competing camps or interests or factions or however you wanna phrase that, right? Um, but we all know, like, it's an open secret that, like, the medical half, like, a lot of these policymakers or advocates or whatever, we're advocating for it because it has medical benefits, right? And that's true, but also it was the perfect, like, foot in the door to say, like, "Hey, well, now that we have medical, I mean, like, well, shit. I mean, people should be able to smoke pot, right? And you see that in almost every state, right? It's a practical means to an end. Um, so, like, you look at, and I know this to be the case in Illinois when it was the Compassionate Use or Care Act or whatever nonsense they called it. Um, but it was like you didn't want to qualify at first, right? Like you were fucking dying,
Yeah,
pretty much
basically.
exactly.
right? But then slowly but surely, it gets kind of whittled away and lobbied at until you arrive to this point where I forget the comedian's name. I like to give credit where credit's due, but it's like sometimes I get nervous on airplanes and I get sweaty palms, right? And you can get a medical card, right? And then everyone's just getting high.
Yeah.
Um, so like, the one thing, and I kind of just thought of this to be frank. So like, forgive me if it's not entirely sounded out, but like tea, right? Has medical benefits,
Hmm.
right? Like there are good things that come to you, and it's not like this incredibly potent thing. Granted, that being the major difference, right? You don't get like high if you drink tea, um, but like it can have medical benefits, but it can still just be widely accessible and just treated like a normal thing.
Hmm.
Um, and like cannabis is one of those things, right? And I think hemp is kind of like the poster child for this, where it's like, yeah, so like you can have cancer and derive, or epilepsy or Parkinson's or arthritis or rattle off the list, right? And derive like this massive benefit from it, but you don't need to like regulate it like it's a pill, you know? It can just be like this box of tea that like you can also just enjoy it if you're not sick.
Bingo.
Um, yeah.
Bingo.
So that's certainly it kinda makes me angry because, like, there's always, like, the policy half of house, um, that, like, argues for these certain regulatory requirements or whatever to treat it as though it's a like, a pharmaceutical drug or it's, like, fucking uranium isotopes or something, and so it needs to be handled in, like, this very particular way. And some of that is necessary, right? Like, for consumer products that people are smoking
Hmm.
or eating or whatever, like, I'm not throwing the baby with the bathwater out there. Um, but also at the same token, it's like we've been smoking it for thousands of years. Um, Literature's pretty good, like insofar as LD50s. You're gonna pass out from smoking it before you poison yourself.
Yeah.
I think there might be an argument that like no one's ever died on it because no one was ever making 100% like concentrations of it. So like all you could ever do was like smoke it or put it into a butter. But like, you're starting to enter the realm of feasibility, I would guess, if you can give someone like unlimited access to 100% pure, but that goes for anything,
Well, and that's
right?
I
Um,
think I've because I'm familiar with the LD52. That back in the day, I think it was their math was a little wonk, and somebody's tried to look at cannabis again here recently, and somebody I think came up with a number like 36 grams or something like that of solid pure THC would be the number. And like you said, there's a better chance you pass out from that before you ever even are capable of consuming it. And some of these guys that are just doing fat lines of, and we've seen it online, they've got 10, 20 grams on a stick. They're choking themselves before they can ever consume the thing. Like it doesn't make sense. And that LD50 was measured in a like 15-minute window or something, right? So you have to do that in 15 fucking minutes. Like you're done. It's very hard probably to do it, but it's not that it can't be done now, like you just said. But also on the other side of that, like I am one who's gone heavy. Okay, let's go with the medical side of it. All right. But that's why I do this a lot, because I don't really care what we call it. People who have access to this thing and the proper parts of this thing get great regulation on the system that is naturally a regulatory system in our body, right? It's not, it's new, it's something that we're, and even I've heard scientists say, I'm pissed off that they called it an endocannabinoid system, because now everybody goes, that's the weed system and it's not effective for plenty of other things. But if we have other aspects of the plant, even that aren't just cannabinoids and terpenoids that are binding to this system, well, okay, well, then it's just a regulatory system. And at that, we use vitamins to boost and regulate our regulatory systems, right? Our immune system and whatever. Where I've gone on record and said, I hope that at some point we hear the same things, essential cannabinoids, the same way we hear essential fucking vitamins, where if everybody needs to be regulated on their vitamin intake, well, then probably everybody needs to be regulated on their cannabinoid. But it's more of the idea that I think probably more of us having some level of regulation, regardless of what we call it, direct condition treatment or just symptom alleviation or whatever, this thing plays in plenty of different aspects of our body that aren't just intoxicating, right? Though the intoxicating aspect of it and even the placebo, the very nice, I'm in that nice euphoric state of mind, can very much so help the rest of the body medicinally. Um,
Mhm.
there are some properties of this thing that, when treated correctly and when respected, give the consumer, um, whether it's I mean, which I think all of us have the right to, just an individual right to comfort. It just gives them their individual comfort, whether it's here or physically. The fact that you are more comfortable consuming this thing, then I don't really give a fuck, right? Where I'm of the same mindset. Like, I don't care what drugs, right? Like, let them do them. If this is what people want to do, let them fucking do them. But you understand the toxicity levels of these things. You understand that using these things has a very strong potential of even death at the end of it, right? So, like, any logical human.
Well, yeah, because to that point, right, like, everyone always, makes the argument that it's, like, super healthy and super safe, but, like, okay, well, when it comes to, like, burning any plant matter,
Hmm.
like, if you look at cigarettes, everyone's like, "Oh, yeah, that's
Yeah.
obviously bad," but, like, if you're smoking a joint, same idea, right? You can make the argument that, like, maybe dabs or vapes or gummies are a little bit cleaner of a method to do all that, but again, like, the devil's in the details, right? So it's, like, how you're actually consuming these things that makes,
But I can
a
show
big
you
difference.
also the inside of this very not clean thing. Like, there's stuff getting past the filtration even. There's stuff that's going
Mhm.
past where throwing this resinous whatever into our lungs, is it the best for our systems in the long run? Maybe not, right? Where I would love to see a suspension of cannabis, right? That isn't just where we've taken the cannabinoids, we've activated them, and like almost like an inhaler. But what is the carrier in the inhaler, right? Where is it where it's like, okay,
Yeah,
we
it's
got to
always a
get it
risk
in
trade-off.
somehow,
Yeah.
right?
No, and that's a very
Hmm.
real conversation, right? So that's where, like, for example, I wanna say, these inhalers, these are, like, the new ones. People are probably familiar with this. Most people probably have asthma. But these are non-HFA. So prior to this, they used to have inhalers that had a different carrier, um, and it actually, for me personally, worked a lot better. I found it to be a better product. But then they changed it. And the funny reason why they changed it actually had nothing to do for, like, the, efficacy of the actual propellant they were using. It was because it was a greenhouse gas. So, like, China can stand up a coal plant a day and burn tons and tons of carbon dioxide and all that sort of stuff. But the real problem is that asthmatics across the country have inhalers that have, these really tiny amounts of these propellants that are bad for the environment. So that's where we're going to put our foot down and stop them.
Well,
Um, but yeah, there's a risk trade-off with everything, right? So, vaping versus smoking it, if you're doing it for funsies, that's one thing. If you're actually like sick, and you're using it more in like a medical or therapeutic type of regime, then you're probably going to be more cognizant of that. So I would certainly say, like, you know, um, with the exception of diabetes not being on the table, because like gummies have sugar
well,
generally.
cancer too.
Um,
Cancer eats sugar like it's going out of style. So
yeah,
and it's like that's like a systemic failure again too. Like go to cancer research and then there's fucking donuts at the front and they're like, "Oh, you're going through hell, like have a donut, whatever." It's like the fucking worst things we can do for people, but in actual therapeutics like you're saying, there's probably a better way to treat some things, right? And like um there's a point that I wanted to make too. This is, I think, one of the moments that I was like, "Oh my god, what was I going to talk about?" We were talking about different like cleanliness of the product and how clean is it and what solvent are you using, is the solvent the problem or not. Well, like the original RSO, from my understanding, Rick Simpson oil, Rick Simpson himself made a naphthalene extracted cannabis product. All right, and he
geez.
got a good success from it. I think he was good at boiling off the naphthalene or whatever it was. That's what his
Yeah, to get it at an acceptable level. Yeah.
Right. So, but then he got very good success with topical skin cancer. Well, naphthalene is like a plant extract, right? Like, so if we had the cleanest form of naphtha, right? And we refined that down and we made sure that we cleaned the naphthalene off the best that we could at the end, and we retained that product still from a naphthalene extract, does that added extra naphtha that might be there, is that a benefit to the skin cancer, right? Like I mean, it's paint thinner, so is that killing some of the topical skin cells that are causing the cancer or
Along
are
with it.
cancerous
Yeah.
themselves, on top of the cannabis being available inside the product as well? Which is why I've always been poo-pooey about Rick Simpson, but I'm also like, why aren't we paying attention to other parts of this that might be more important?
Like relevant, and we're just not giving it the due like interest or respect.
Yeah, well,
Yeah, and so insofar as like choice of like solvents and stuff like that, I generally just try to go for like the least invasive stuff. So both for like health and human safety reasons as well as like economics, like buying and scaling an operation to do extractions with like naphthalene, fucking
oh
expensive.
yeah,
You know what's really cheap? Ethanol. Right,
100%.
and, like, people drink it recreationally, so, like, if there's a little bit of it in your product, you're not probably hurting many people. Um, so it's certainly just, like, using the right tool for the right job. If you're making some, like, weird therapeutic or something like that, and it just only dissolves in naphthalene, you don't wanna not make it, right? So, like, it's a cost benefit analysis, then we're gonna use it, right? But, like, I can use all sorts of things to do cannabis, so I'm not gonna immediately jump to, like, an expensive or much more dangerous solvent. I'm generally gonna use cheaper, safer stuff like CO2, ethanol, and so on and
Butane
so
still
forth.
too, yeah.
Yeah, butane.
Yeah. Yeah, and that's what like I've thought that there's a ton to this thing obviously that has not been explored or found out or whatever, but I also don't
That
know.
was part of the allure, I would say, to going into the hemp side of things. Because during my time at, like, Rev, there was, like, some, like, minor interest, no pun intended, in minor, cannabinoids and terpenes and stuff like that, but it was really just, um just to make, like, more pure THC, right? Or, do testing on the plants to figure out which ones were higher potency so those can be crossed. It was very much like hammer and a nail, and we kinda just blew past the opportunity to look at other different things, right? Whereas, like, the hemp side, like, started at a disadvantage because essentially the regulated markets have a monopoly on THC,
Mhm.
right? That changed a couple years back because a pretty pervasive method of converting CBD into D8 and D9 came out to the market. And then coupled with poorly written legislation and high paid lawyers, the sector as a whole was able to kind of stick its foot in the door and compete like toe to toe with dispensaries and MSOs. Um, But like at the inception, at least, I know when I was the director over at Mia, we had actually spent close to like $1.2 million on this giant chromatography skid. So it's like it was basically altogether the size of like 3 semi trailers, and the idea was to do what's called prep scale, or like practical scale
Mhm.
separation of these compounds. So the idea was to take this poop soup of CBD and all these other cannabinoids in the hemp, push it through this machine that would essentially separate it out into its constituent parts, so then you'd get a fraction of THC, CBD, CBN, and so on and so forth. And then we could process those further, clean them up, and then essentially have all these different isolates. And it did work to some success. So technically speaking, it worked. Where the whole project failed was the economics of it, right? So what someone is actually willing to pay for some of these minor cannabinoids and the use cases for them, which back then were smaller because we didn't know as much, um, but it just wasn't there. The money and the interest is always in THC and slightly lesser so in CBD. Um, but a lot of the hemp stuff did push a lot of kind of innovation in the space as it related to investigating, because you got to think like the MSOs, like the one thing that they basically have to mess with is the THC and CBD content of their plants. But there's all these different cultivars of hemp that produce all these other different cannabinoids. I know most notably CBG is a pretty readily available a cannabinoid that you can get
Mhm.
that grows with the same predominance that a cannabis plant would grow THC. Um, and then you had people starting to mess around with that, making it available to researchers, things of that nature to then be further studied. Um, but the funny thing is, like, certainly when I started, you kind of look at the plan as like a utilitarian sort of thing where it's like it's made for us and it does all these things to us. But the funny thing is, like, from an evolutionary standpoint, it's kind of weird that any of these compounds really exist,
Mhm.
just because principally, and this was a discussion I had with an evolutionary biologist at my alma mater, U of I, Urbana-Champaign, whoop, whoop, ILL. Um, but but principally, the idea is that the THC and all the terpenes were there to essentially be like an anti-insecticide,
Mhm.
Mhm.
right? So it keeps the bugs away.
Mhm.
Yep.
And then the cannabinoids, um, the interesting thing about them is that they absorb UV light. Practically speaking, you guys know this because that's why if you leave plants out in a field and don't cut them down, they oxidize and degrade into CBN,
Mhm.
right?
Yep.
But the idea is it's essentially like a sunscreen for the plant,
Mhm.
Mhm.
right? So when it's naturally out in the sun, being bombarded by this UVA, B, and C rays or whatever from the sun,
Mhm.
this THC and CBD stuff basically absorbs that UV light because of its aromaticity, and then basically that protects the plant. And then that in turn, you can imagine from an evolutionary point of view, protects the DNA of that plant. So that way it doesn't get, I guess, the plant equivalent of cancer.
Right.
That's where I'm not a botanist. So,
No, yeah.
we'll trail off from there, do your own investigation. But I thought that was a pretty interesting thing. And then it's just rather surreptitious that, like, well, if monkeys ingest it, right, like us,
Mhm.
then you get high, right? Or you get this euphoria or you feel wellness coursing through your body or whatever. So it's just an interesting, like, that's kind of the perspective I try to look at it. It's just happen chance that some of these things do actually work.
Well, I mean, the universe is under no obligation to make any sense to anybody at any time.
Exactly right.
You know what I mean? So
Mhm.
it is what it
So
is.
I did, to segue a little bit, I did want to ask you, David. So, I've done a lot of different gigs in a lot of different places. I've done consulting gigs in Texas. More recently, I was out in South Dakota. I've worked for a number of different businesses in Illinois on the hemp and cannabis side. But like now, I'm like looking back, and I was talking to Aaron about this earlier, regarding like Michigan versus Illinois. What do you feel is like the problem in Illinois from like the dispensary side, right? Because you're actually like front lines compared to me. Um, Like, what do you feel it really comes down to, right? Do you think, like, the quality of stuff is better in Michigan because
No.
like, there's more competition, or do you think it's just, like, a tax
The
problem? Like, what do you think it
taxes
is?
are huge. That I just was having this conversation with somebody earlier today. Taxes are big. I think the allure to deli style right now for somebody who's never been able to access cannabis at a like we go into the iPhone store and there's like 70 iPhones there, right? It's just one iPhone, but you got like 70 of them displayed and you can touch all of them, but it's like one thing. And I know there's obviously plenty to that, but like people are going to go get the fucking one, right? So, um, I just think that like nobody's had access to it. Nobody's been able to play with anything. Nobody's been able to touch anything. So Michigan, you immediately go, "Oh, I get to smell it. Oh, I'm naughty. I'm going to Michigan." But it's the reality of why people are going to Michigan is in the budget. There's no way that um it's multiple aspects of that though, right? The initial cost of the product is less for some of the recyclables, right? And that's like carts and gummies and whatever. Quality product costs the same everywhere. Go I literally from coast to coast because I've been to a lot of these different markets to explore them. They all cost the same. It's you got your average 60, you got your average 100 for different like there's just that average price point. Um, but a lot of the average consumers, the same way that you said, we don't give a fuck, right? Nobody cares. Just give me access to this thing. And I don't care if it's tutti frutti. I don't care if it's whatever. I'm just in the exploratory aspect of it. Illinois does not allow you to explore anything. Um, and I think that like,
Well, and it shows in the numbers too, to your point, 'cause, I was talking about this Aaron to Aaron earlier, and I did
Mhm.
actually look up the numbers. So, like, Michigan by population has, like, 10 million people. Illinois, I think, is at about
mhm,
12. Most of that obviously being, like, Chicago, right? But evidently, Illinois to date for 2024 only did 1.5 billion, and
yes,
this is,
that's
like,
correct.
from the website. Whereas Michigan,
Closer to,
to date for 2024 is at, like, 3.3
yeah,
billion, so it's literally double
well,
despite the fact that they have what, like, 15% less
Mhm.
people?
so there's
Um,
multiple purposes for that, right? Like, but you can also go look at them numbers and see how much of it is non-state money that's coming to Michigan. And I think it's more than if I'm not wrong, I think it's like a third, if not more than that, right? So
yeah, so you're saying, like, Hoosiers from Indiana are rolling up, Ohio,
we're sending
Illinois.
hundreds of millions of dollars that way. We know
Yeah,
it
and it's kind of wild that we're at a point, like, with the way the system's kinda constructed, that, like, it's literally cheaper for you to do a road trip to another state to
through
get the same product,
through
and it's cheaper than driving down the block and going to someone like you at the dispensary
I
and buying
I'll
something.
give you a direct instance, okay? There's one I have one sitting in front of me, not even mad to talk about them. This is a cushy punch, okay? In Michigan, you can buy 7, 8, 10 of these for $100, okay? Most of the time you get
What is
taxed.
that, a gram or a
This
half?
is a gram. Most of that you'll get taxed maybe 20%, whatever, okay? So I got 10 of these things for 120 bucks. In Illinois, one of these is 60, maybe 70, depends on what dispensary you go to, whatever. And then that's going to get hit at what, 35%. So by the time that you're done with this one, it's $90. We're talking about
Yeah.
recycled garbage, bro. You know that there's nothing different about this compared to what's over there. And their proprietary flavonoids or whatever they're using to put back into this thing, they're theirs. They're going to use the same shit over there as they're going to use over here. So you're
Yeah, they're
literally
all buying their genetics from similar places anyway, so it's not like there's a real market difference in, like, the plant that you're gonna be getting in Michigan. There is an argument because they do, uh,
Mhm.
do,
yeah.
um, but they do outdoor a lot more readily, in Michigan, which does have a big impact on, like, how it actually tastes or, like, how the terpenes get expressed.
And
In Illinois, starting with some of that, I did go down to what was it Nature's
yep,
Grace, I
nature's
wanna
is
say?
the outdoor people.
Down
Yep,
Yep.
they got some of that, I toured their
yep,
facility. It's kinda wild because it looks like a hospital in there.
yep.
So there's like bumper guards and stuff on the walls, and like
Mhm.
a lot of what they do down there is mobile. It's really interesting how they have everything set up. Their operation is definitely pretty cool. Um, but uh, but yeah, like the artificial cap on like canopy space and stuff like that, I think is pretty prohibitive in terms of like just getting volume of product out.
100%.
Um, and it is kind of funny to me too, because like from the hemp side, it's slightly different because typically a lot of this stuff gets sold in like smoke shops,
Yep.
right? That's like most of it. Obviously, there's some gas stations or whatever.
Yep.
You'll get like the occasional CBD store. Um, but the vast majority is smoke shops. Smoke shops operate a little differently than like a dispensary. They will typically buy from a distributor, much like Benny's or anything else. Um, and so, like, you get this chain of markups, right? So, like, if it costs me $10 to make, then I sell it to the distributor for 20, and then it goes to the retail guy who marks it up, another 100%, and then he's selling it for 40. So everyone's got room in the chain to eat. And even under that math, which is tracks pretty well if you have like a pretty decently scaled operation and you got halfway decent prices,
Mhm.
is still cheaper than a scenario where you basically have a grower who's vertically integrated processing and selling it directly to the dispensary, and it's like, 2/3 the cost. That should tell you right there, right? Like between the taxes, and everything else, that's just kinda wild.
There's a lot of uh so there's way less grown here than there, right? And you said it perfectly. The artificial number of square feet that you're allowed to grow under, this arbitrary number that they just came up with out of nowhere, um, prohibits even the big players from getting bigger. So then we go to outdoor or something of that nature, which is a possibility here in the near future, as long as you get all the whatever. But then, like, it sucks because now all of the big players have the access to the outdoor, and the small players have zero access. They got
Mhm.
5,000 square feet, big players 220,000 square feet. And then big players can do, I forget what the outside space is, however many acres, whatever. But then as a craft whatever now so like the regulations in Illinois prevent that, where in Michigan, as you probably,
Yeah, anything goes, pay the fee, get the
Yeah.
license, and then it's off to the
bro,
races.
people are
But it
growing in their
is
backyard or in their basement and selling shit into processors and shit as caregivers, and they were all under, now it's tightened up a little bit more recently, but some of these
yeah, so I've heard.
caregivers have, they were in it long enough that now they have their whatever little processing licenses or whatever, and it's good for them. They deserve it because they've been doing it for forever. But yeah, there's just so much more up there.
Yeah, but certainly it's, the inverse of that, and I'll probably speak to this, a little more, is on the flip side, though, as a business, it is pretty shitty to work up in Michigan just because the volume of competition you have to deal with,
Stress.
basically incentivizes a race to the bottom,
Yep.
Mhm.
and so there are a number of operators out there, who are operating at a loss.
Oh, I
Right, because in order to keep with their competition, right, the one thing people fundamentally care about is the price, right? You can put the best Chat GPT generated fucking logo art on your box,
Engaging.
and you can get the most wily sales guy and marketing dude and do this whole ad campaign, but at the end of the day, if I show up to your place and it's, like, pretty much the same product as anything else I can get, but it's, like, double the price, I'm not fucking buying it,
Yeah.
Well, and that
right?
that falls into this, like, cannabis is just a general fuck it all that has a very good ability of working. Like, especially if you're inhaling it. We don't have a lot of barrier to entry, right? Like, our lungs are very efficient actually at absorbing this thing and getting it into the bloodstream and then dumping everywhere. And like you said, it's directly to the fucking brain from the lungs, right? So like, you're going to get a heavier dose of this thing. You're going to feel something from it most of the time. So what the hell's the difference in the $1 swept up joint that, you literally pick some shit up off the ground and put it into a joint for me that's actually going to do something for me, or the $10 joint? For you and I, we all know the difference, but to the average consumer, and to the average consumer who also, I mean, the budget that some of these people are coming in with, it's, it needs to be a $20 situation, right? And this $20
Yeah.
gotta last me for the week. You can't do that in Illinois. You almost just can't.
Oh,
Doesn't
absolutely
doesn't
not.
matter what product line or what method of ingestion you wanna get into, you can't do that. But people can do that in Michigan, right? And then the weirdness to that is, okay, so if I, you know, if I buy the one of these here and it costs me, by the time everything's done, tax rate and whatever, it's $90 or 80, let's even call it. And the out there, I get 10 of them for 120. Now I'm looking at the math and I'm going, okay, I'm going to get $900, $800 worth of value to go take a trip really quick. The gas cost is 30, $40. We can bitch about gas prices, but it's far less.
Even when you factor it in, it's still
Yeah.
cheaper, and that's kind of the whole funny part to me.
I had some
And what's frustrating about it all is, like, it is all self-imposed, and, I think right now, in Illinois, at least, there's this whole hubbubaloo about hemp, um, and the, uh, hemp-derived THC and whether or not that's any like, materially different than, like, normal THC. And so, you have people who are, like, in dispensaries, for example, and they're incredibly frustrated because the smoke shop down the street doesn't have to pay all these incredulous fees to own and operate a licensed, dispensary, and they can still basically sell THC.
Mhm.
Um, and so there's, like, this argument, that basically comes out that, like, they need to be regulated, and I'm much more of, like, a free market, like, Milton Friedman libertarian type
I
when it comes to, like, the marketplace side of things.
Mhm.
And, the irony of it is, like, this whole industry was basically born out of, like, "Keep the government out of it," you
Mhm.
know? And now we're, like, off to the races going, like, "Please regulate me harder." Um, and obviously, there are certain elements of it that are, like, necessary, like, I think most importantly from, like, a health and human safety for, nutraceuticals or pharmaceuticals or whatever, I feel like that should kinda hold. But this whole tax regime, is just born out of necessity from mismanagement at the state level, and so it's just a treasure chest to be plundered. Um, and that's so, like, readily apparent, and it's a shame because it fundamentally comes at the cost of, people who are employed in the industry, right? Because if your business is as a consequence of, poor regulation or lack of regulation, as it relates to, for example, payment processing
Hmm.
or certain, tax considerations, like, you're just not getting paid as much.
Right.
There's no room in the budget to pay you, even if you do bring that value, right? um, that hurts people being employed, right? And it hurts growing out the businesses, which is fundamentally like the whole argument that they made when it came to the social equity licenses and stuff, right? We're going to bring employment and opportunity
Mhm.
into these places and expunge records and stuff, some of which has been delivered on, but like also you're like artificially capping how much they can grow.
Yep.
Right, and I mean that both literally in the sense of, like, the plant and canopy space they can have,
Mhm.
and, like, more metaphorically in terms of, like, how big can they actually scale their business, and how much of that pie do they get to keep. Um, and then likewise, from a customer standpoint, like, you're paying more than most other states for the same stuff. The experience is rather lacking, so it's just all around, like, a really, really poor system.
Mhm.
And truth be told, I don't really know, like, if I were if I wore my personality on my sleeve and I just wanted to compete for, like, some sort of interest and just say, like, "Oh, yeah, well, you know what? They should just make the hemp shit illegal. No Delta-8 or hemp-derived THC, and all you can do is buy your weed at my shitty dispensary for 500% the cost of what it should be." You know, I would make that argument, but I don't think that's the case. And likewise, you can make the argument, "Oh, well, the dispensaries suck, and the regulators just big weed, man," you know? And they're just, like, zooming up all these profits and stuff, and you just gotta go with the hemp stuff because it really goes to the people. Like, I can make that argument, but I think the truth of the matter is, like, they kinda just need to get out. Like, the whole regulation which is never gonna happen, because the money is ultimately what dictates
Mhm.
it. But, like, there are no technical barriers. I think that would be, like, my big takeaway in terms of, what can be done. And, like, there's a lot of shit kinda coming down the pipe that I think is gonna radically change that, like, I don't know that the state's really equipped to handle it, right? So, a good example of this, um No, it's not Skylabs. Is it Encore? There's a particular company out there. There's a few actually. I just know of one where they're essentially using like Cas9 and CRISPR to genetically modify yeast cells.
Mhm.
And so they're essentially taking particular, like, and I'm not a biologist, so grain of salt here on the technical details, but essentially the logic is they take certain genes and enzymes out of cannabis or hemp. They essentially marry that into these yeast cells, and then they're able to essentially brew weed. But what comes out of it still needs to get processed, right? So it would kind of be on like an apples to apples basis. It would be like doing an ethanol extraction, except the difference is I don't need to pay a grower and an army of people to manage all these plants. I don't, if you take the HVAC and electricity costs from bringing the outside inside, don't have to pay any of that. That doesn't exist. Um, so it's like economically, like, you're talking about factors of 10, and that's where you would see a big difference. Um, and I don't know, like, what these growers are gonna do. Like, there's always gonna be a collection of people who are about, like, the plant and Delta 9 and CBD, but there's shit coming where it's not gonna be a plant anymore, right? And what do you do then, right? And how do you even regulate that? It's a whole different can of worms. And then likewise,
Do you think they
like, when it
call it
comes to the
something
feds.
different, or
Oh, go ahead.
I'm sorry to interrupt you. Do you think they then try to call it something different, or do you think they stay under the name Delta 9 THC, or because
No, chemically, it's the same
it's
thing.
chemically the same?
Delta 9 is Delta
Yep,
9,
period.
right? So this whole hemp-derived THC thing is born out of, more of a legal, like,
Classification.
classification thing. It's more of a tax problem than it is like a
Yep,
technical
yep,
identification thing, right? Um, so if it comes from hemp or if it comes from cannabis, it's the same shit,
bingo.
right? Um, but the thing is there's a tax implication if I grow it from what is genetically considered to be cannabis, um, versus if it's genetically considered hemp, right? So that's more of what that means. And so you could just take the same sort of logic and apply it to the yeast stuff, right? By all accounts, it's still Delta 9.
Bingo.
I think the only thing you're really going to be missing is like and again, this depends on form factor, right? But like in an apples to apples case where it's like a vape, what you're going to be missing is like the terpenes,
Is it
right? That's probably the biggest
is
thing.
it only Delta 9, or is
No, so and
the whole molecular chain?
they've practically done everything.
Okay,
Right? Um, so I think they've obviously, for the same reasons I listed before, it's mostly THC, Delta 9 THC and CBD, because that's like the most of the market. Maybe the last 10% that those two don't cover is like CBN and CBG and all the other shit. But yeah, that's mostly where they're going. But in theory, you could do it with everything because I know the technical process involves essentially generating a Livitol, which is the same thing that is like think like a precursor. It's like the initial framework that then gets in the cannabis plant biologically modified that eventually through a series of different steps biologically and chemically gets converted in the plant into what you would then recognize as like THC or CBD.
different, yeah,
If you look up a picture of a Livitol, it looks like very similar to THC and CBD at a molecular level. Um, and like the presence of some of these other cannabinoids is more a function of the process to develop delta 9 THC. So, like CBG
yep,
is really interesting if you get it as an isolate because CBD basically looks like a block at like a chemical level. And so when you turn it into an isolate, it typically has like a very granular and powdery sort of physical manifestation. But CBG, if you look at that, basically looks like a line at like a chemical level. And so what's really interesting about that is when you actually get it as an isolate, um, it's like greasy, right? So like when you're like handling it with your gloves or your hands, it's almost like kind of like a lubricant. And that's because it's like these like thin chains that slide past each other at a chemical level a lot more readily than like two CBD blocks, if that kind of makes
yep.
sense. Um, But the CBG thing essentially just kind of wraps on itself through some enzymatic processes, and then that's actually what forms the cycles in the delta 9 or CBD
Yeah.
that you see. So it's like a precursor.
And that's exactly what I've always, and Aaron and I have been talking about a lot lately too. Like I think they call CBG like the mother terp or some shit
Hmm.
of that nature. There's like a name that they use it, or I've heard it before. But
I'm not familiar with it, but it would make
yeah,
sense.
and I think that's because of, and you were actually, I think, one of the first people who um, made it make sense in my brain. And it was almost specifically with this conversation where like this thing literally folds in on itself,
Hmm.
becomes this like other thing, and then through the process of breaking it apart or doing whatever is just more of the other names that we're calling this thing along the way. And like which then like
Yeah, it's specifically, I wanna say, like, an intramolecular cyclic reaction. So inter means between, intra means within, and essentially it's just making a cycle, right, which is those 2 rings that you see. And then, like, the whole thing about, like, delta 8 or delta 9 to just kind of, run down that road is you have these double bonds that exist in the ring. So delta 9 is making reference to where this particular double bond is within that cyclic structure. And all of those carbons in the ring are essentially numbered. So when you have the bond in this position, it's a delta 9. If you shift it over one, it's delta 8. So it's not like this radically different compound in the same way that like THCO acetate would be. It's just essentially shifting a bond, and what it practically does um, is essentially like how much of an affinity, essentially like how much of a perfect fit it is to like the hand and glove of your
Yep.
brain is like moderately different. And so if you ask people, that's what's perceived as it having a lower potency. It's because a lot of this shit is just banging around randomly in your brain, and less of it basically sticks to these different receptors. I'm distilling the technical complexity of that
it,
out, but that's essentially in a nutshell, like the whole
It
thing.
doesn't interact with our brain as easily.
it-
Yeah, in a nutshell, yeah.
but Alex, that's why I also love you, is because you speak at a very high level but in a way that a lot of us can understand. And you're not like, I think for the technical people, you know enough where like the technical people will hear you and go, holy shit, this dude knows what he's talking about. But then the general public isn't like
Hmm.
overwhelmed by the information where you're
Yeah,
just
glossy-eyed.
bingo, right?
Well, and that's the big thing I've noticed because 'cause I've been in a lot of different meetings and I've met a lot of different people. It's pretty easy to tell, when people know their stuff or when they don't, just because the more big words they use more frequently, they're kinda, like, leaning on the authority that the
Hmm.
word carries, right? But they themselves don't really understand it. Whereas, like, if you can actually distill it down into much more, like, simple and easy to understand stuff,
Sure.
then you probably actually know it, right? And that's just the mantra that I've kinda, tried to hold, because you can get, well, and we all probably know this because it's the cannabis industry after all, but you can get a billion people to dazzle you with bullshit. It's really hard to find people who can actually succinctly do things like that. And certainly reading a lot does help. I remember when I was at Rev, like most of my like formal education and like laboratory work and stuff was originally born out of doing like analysis.
Hmm.
So I worked for like a bunch of different research groups. The first one, we were doing like photoacoustic dyes. So essentially, the logic was like um, you can have a higher fidelity ultrasound, right? And so you inject this dye. Essentially, it has this particular molecular structure on it that's kind of like a tuning fork. So then, when you hit it with sound at a particular frequency, it essentially causes it to vibrate, and then that would make another part of the chemical fluoresce is the technical term, but it would emit light, and then you could perceive that light. And the result of doing this very convoluted thing would be that you get like HD ultrasounds, and then it would help diagnosticians and stuff identify whatever. And so then we were tasked with making all sorts of compounds that would bind to different analytes within your body. So you can make one that binds to copper, you can make one that binds to calcium, and so on and so forth. And then the idea is like you can map where all these things are going in your body. And then the other group I worked for well, I say work, but I was, undergraduate researcher, so working for free. Um, but they were doing the uptake of different drugs in brain cells. So we were doing something called MALDI-TOF imaging, which is matrix-assisted laser deposition and ionization time of flight. Damn, that's been a minute. But essentially, it's like you take a little slice of something. We were doing brain tissue, actually. So we went with a slug, which was like buccal aplasia. It's like the simplest neural structure you can find. And then we would go all the way up to like chimpanzee brains. And then we would essentially dose them with different drugs. And then the idea is you have this like slice of this particular tissue you're looking at, and then you would divide that into like a very fine tic-tac-toe board. You zap each square within that board with a laser. That's like the ionization and deposition part. It basically is kind of like the equivalent at a chemical level of taking a car and just smashing it into a fucking wall at like 100 miles per hour. And if it's made of parts, they're going flying, right? And then the idea is you would look at the wreckage to try and identify, what the car is principally composed of. And we would do the same thing with these different parts of the tissue. And so then the time of flight part is like depending on the weight. You can imagine the steering wheel is going to go flying because it's super light. The engine block is probably going to stay where you smashed into the wall, right? Because it's a super heavy thing. And so you can essentially identify stuff based off of that. And then when you wrap that all together after you've zapped the whole thing, essentially what that allows you to do is make like a heat map. So you can see like, and the group was principally focused on opiates at the time, which turned out to be, I now recognize in retrospect, like super relevant because like Oxycontin and Purdue Pharma and all that ended up becoming a really massive thing in the opioid crisis and all that. Um, but essentially what that allows you to do is make like a heat map to see like where all these different compounds are going within this slice of tissue. So you can see like, oh, okay, if you do opiates, they concentrate in these particular regions of the brain, right? And then that can be informative to, research for other elements. So all of that's a very long-winded to say that I didn't look at cannabis like when I was in college and stuff. There's no class for it or anything like that. So then when I was at Rev, I like felt kind of incompetent, right? And there was like a lot of these guys who, by all accounts, like were not as formally trained as I was, so they weren't like nerds in the lab coat and stuff. But like if you needed to bang out some super fucking clean, super nice cured resin or live resin or whatever, like Sam was your man. Like that was the guy that taught me like a shitload. He's since gotten out. He's retired, big dick energy and stuff. But that being said, I felt like really intimidated because, of course, it was like, well, I'm the smart guy and I got a college degree. And then I found out that I was fucking stupid,
Right.
right? Practically speaking. So then I ended up, and I would encourage everyone to do this, is go on PubMed and just search cannabis and just start fucking reading, right? And so that's where like I got a lot of this sort of information that I've shared, right? So I've looked at everything from like adolescent use and like the sociological aspects of like how much of it is catching on and like what are the impacts on brain development and stuff, all the way to like what we were talking about earlier, right? Like these morphology of like all the different types of cannabis, like you were mentioning stuff grown in the mountains versus stuff that's grown, closer to the equator and so on and so forth, and like the different cannabinoid distributions, like the effects or like lit reviews of like CBD or THC. I even found papers from I think it was Roger Adams, and that was like the particular building that I was doing some classes and undergrad research for the chemistry stuff at U of I. Little did I know until after the fact that he was actually one of like the core guys, or it's Roger Morris. I'm gonna have to Google this in a second, but like he was researching like converting cannabinoids and stuff back in like the 40s.
Oh wow.
So it's really interesting because when you look at the papers, you can tell that they were actually written with a typewriter. So like if you look at a modern chemistry paper, it's all like, PC generated like molecular structures and stuff. But then when he's talking about like what he thinks the structure of CBD or THC is, he's like making it with dashes on a typewriter. Right. So
Wow.
it's just kind of like this quirky thing.
That's cool.
But yeah, and that was actually where I got the original idea to do CBD conversion in the CBN rather than doing it with, I believe it's done with iodine. If you're going to go like the chemical, let's carpet bomb it route, I actually achieved it with UV light. Essentially, I think I still have my lab notebook. Hold on, give me a second.
How fucking awesome! I could
Mm-hmm.
listen to this dude talk forever, bro.
Oh yeah.
Love it.
So interesting.
Oh, sorry about that. Yeah, hold on. So I've kept the same lab notebook for like pretty much everything that I've done. Oh wait, I've got this upside down. I don't know if I have the same Roger Adams paper. Oh yeah, here it is. This is all the CBN conversion stuff I did. Hold on. Yeah, so that's the original notes. I don't know if you can really read those. Um,
Whoa.
but essentially I did like a dish, and I bought a reptile light.
Mm-hmm.
Um, which is particular because it does generate UV, which is what you
Yep.
need, right? And essentially, I did a dish with that, and like for all of this, I basically took like crude, out of a crude resin, just out of a BHO, and just threw it in a pan. And then I just like put it in this little table and covered it with like a cloth, so there was no like outside light or anything like that. And then I did one with just UV light, one with UV light and heat, one with just heat, and then one that I did nothing to basically just have a control. Um, and basically, it like logically, it's the heat and the UV that made the biggest difference. And then I want to say it went from, let's see, where's my notes? Yeah, it went from 0.4% CBN, which was the control, and I jacked it up to 22% with no added chemicals or anything like that.
Whoa.
Um, Granted, that shit was darker than the night.
Oh yeah.
So like it was not, you're oxidizing the shit
Yeah.
out of
Yeah.
it. Um, but that definitely made you go night night. We ended up taking it, and because it wasn't like fit for sale to do into like a cartridge, for a number of reasons. CBN also has like this very like glass sort of effect. Um, so if you have a significant concentration of it, like if you think carts gumming up is a problem now, if I put like a significant amount of CBN in it, it's pretty problematic. It's not gonna flow, you know. So we ended up basically just crushing it up and mixing it with a matrix. I think I did like cornstarch or something, in a binder, and then we put it into capsules, and that was basically it. And it did actually work pretty well for only being like 20% CBN. So I wouldn't even know if you could like, and there's ways to like scale that up. I have some ideas, uh, but yeah, certainly I would be curious to see like what 100% CBN would do. Plus, I feel like it's a cleaner product too,
Yeah.
because then you're not adding. It's like the rosin argument, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's like, yeah, I just press it together, no solvents, man. Um, which, granted, that's like purely logical. Yeah, see, and it smokes good. It's an entirely different product,
It's great.
but yeah, that's the sort of
Full
stuff,
spectrum.
that kinda went through, and I had hit a point where, um, I had printed out, and I've since lost it, I don't know where it went, but I had, like, a box. It was about the size of a shoebox, about that big, and I had literally every single paper I had printed out, read, annotated, and highlighted, and then once I was, like, done with it, I threw it into this box, and by the time I was done, you know what I mean, with that whole, endeavor.
Mm-hmm.
It was like pretty heavy. If I smacked you over the head with it, you'd get a concussion.
Yeah, it was a
You know?
phone book, huh?
Yeah, but now, I mean, you can just go on to
Yep.
PubMed, and like it has exploded. Like if I just go on there right now,
It's literally
I
that's
could
where
tell you
I've
that.
read most
Mm-hmm.
of my stuff, but I also too like again Israel is the spot, right? Like a lot of the stuff that I've seen, there's a couple of guys that I got like all nerded out about for a while. There was this cat, David Miri, um, out in Israel that was absolutely killing the game, like as far as cannabis research and individual cannabinoids and testing on. He was the guy who did a lot of like lab testing on rats. With
I think Meachelcom too, I want to say, is another big one. I think he was an Israeli
who
researcher,
Machulam?
or still is. Mechulam, sorry, mispronouncing
Machulam
the name.
passed away
Yeah,
last year, 2 years ago.
a
He passed away
couple years ago,
recently.
right? It was recently.
But yeah, he's the one who mapped I don't know if he mapped the endo. He was the first one to draw the molecular structure of, I want to say THC, but it might have been CBD. One of the two, he was the one to do that. And then I think he was heavily in mapping of the endocannabinoid system as well. But like Machulam's the guy. Like if you want to read really good cannabis stuff, go read Machulam. But he also didn't do like a lot of public shit. He's got a few books and stuff, but he also collabed a lot with a lot of people. But he was a true professor in the form that like he was trying to teach all of these other people, and that's why I think Miri, the guy that was talking about David Miri, I think he worked with Machulam, and that's why I have such an affinity for him. Anybody who worked with him had one of the ones who really cared about it on a molecular level, working and guiding them. So uh,
Yeah, because 'cause I'm looking here really quick. So the guy's name was Roger Adams, I was right about that, and he, had successfully isolated and identified CBD out of hemp and cannabis in
and
1940.
then Machulam was THC then in probably I think
Yeah,
you might get me wrong, but I think it was the 70s. I don't know.
yeah, something like that.
But
But yeah, it's a rich history. I mean, there's even papers you can find on PubMed that go back to, like, the
yep,
1800s. I think it was, like, a British guy in India, um, and I forget what it was, but it was, like, an Indian guy that was sick with some particular, affliction, I can't quite recall right now, but essentially the guy basically gets they call it hashish in there,
yep.
um, or, there's a weird name for it in the paper, but essentially he treats him with hash, and the guy's like, "I feel better," and then, like, lived, and so it actually turned into, like, a medical publication that, you can actually still read to this day, it's really interesting. But yeah, but, like, now it's wild because, like, just looking, just from 2024 to 2025, within the last year, there's 4,000 different papers, everything from, like, cannabis and pregnancy, evaluation of the efficacy and safety of cannabidiol-rich cannabis extract in children with autism
Oh,
spectrum
and
disorder, randomized, double-blind, placebo-controlled clinical trial, and this stuff comes from all over the world. There's stuff from, like, Spain,
bingo.
Poland's actually pretty big on hemp,
I think
Israel, like we mentioned,
it's in New
the
Zealand or
US now
Australia.
increasingly.
One of the two down unders is also another like place where I used to get a lot of my information from. I did a lot of like,
Yeah, they also have a lot of ruderalis
yeah,
too, that's where it's actually pretty big,
yeah. Was that
I wanna
Australia?
say. It's, like, toward the poles. Yeah,
Yep,
yeah.
yep. I think, well, and you might be right. I don't remember if they found, because Ruderalis, I don't remember the first time if they found it in Australia or if it was in Russia. But I think you're right because I remember
It's the poles, though, that's the
Hmm.
relevant
literally,
part. So you get, like, a different type of plant that's, like, between the equator and, like, the poles. You get a plant that's good at the equator, and then you get, like, ruderalis at the poles where it's, like, this kinda stumpy
yep.
thing, you
Well,
know?
and yeah, shittier climates, less access to sun with regularity, depending on which side you're on. Either you have all the sun all the time or none of the sun all the time, right? And it's like these weird, yeah. But the plant is like that's the brilliance of it. Like this thing's super resilient, and yeah, I don't know, man. I
Yeah. Probably my favorite paper that I read basically had to do with, like, what at a technical level cannabis is really, like, doing inside of your brain. Um, and essentially it, like, basically causes a bunch of your synapses to fire, right? So your brain starts to go into overdrive. Um, but then, right, like, what makes it interesting is, like, well, now you think of, like, Jimi Hendrix, right? Michael Jackson, like, all these different artists and stuff like that who are doing, like, these really creative endeavors. And then you start to realize, like, good art is something that's, like, bridging the gap between things that you would think are otherwise unrelated. It's the same thing is true with, like, comedy, right?
Hmm.
That's why shit's funny because they're making a connection you didn't immediately make, and it's truthful, so it's funny,
Hmm.
right? You laugh about it. Good art, does the same sort of thing. Maybe it doesn't necessarily make you laugh, but it's the same idea. And you kind of wonder, like, how do these people get to this point where, like, they can see those sorts of things? And then it dawns on you that, like, well, from like a technical point of view, right? It causes your brain to make connections that, otherwise through like logical mode of thought, you wouldn't really make. And so obviously that can be a good thing, right? So like for creative endeavors or like problem solving, that's certainly great, but it can also be a bad thing because not everything is related, right? So you have to like filter through the trash. But that's where I think, it gives like a technical explanation for what we all kind of understand anecdotally, that like, when you're not feeling fucking great or you're trying to think through a problem, when you smoke the stuff, that like you start to get a little creative and think outside the box. So I thought that was actually pretty interesting. Certainly the one regarding uh, like the whole relationship to sativa and indica, I thought was pretty interesting. I want to try and find that for you, um, just because when I had uh, initially come into the space, I like 100% gave it credence, right? And then after looking at like an actual study that was kind of analyzing like what the reported effects were, and cross-reference that to like what the strains are identified as, very quickly you're like, holy shit,
Mhm.
like there is like a loose correlation. They actually did like a really nice graphic that kind of plotted it all out. But there's like a loose correlation, but it is like broadly inaccurate to the point of not being useful.
Oh,
Um,
bingo.
but it's still
Yeah.
funny because it's still one of those holdovers that, like, even almost a decade later, is still in play. But I think that has less to do with the technical stuff, right? And has more to do with the pragmatic elements of running a business and marketing and all that, and people wanting simple answers to complex questions.
Yeah. An ever-changing landscape and different rules and different laws and different marketing allowables and, different, did we hit our numbers today? And it all plays into it.
Yeah. I think the one thing I would wanna end on, is insofar as, like, kind of what I see for the future. Um, and so on, like, the technical level, I think a lot of it's gonna come to, like, how we're actually doing this stuff.
Mhm.
So, like, kinda keeping it centered to, like, Illinois, outdoor grow is gonna be a big difference 'cause, once you can start to reduce the cost at the very beginning of that chain, uh, you know, by factors of 10,
Mhm.
right, or fractions. As it propagates up and people are slapping on their markups and everything along the way, and then taxing it and so on and so forth, that's going to make the biggest difference in terms of price, just the greater availability of supply. Um, that and then if, certain technologies like what I was talking about as it relates to, like, the Cas9 and CRISPR editing of
Mhm.
these different, like, yeast cells, like, well, if I don't have to pay HVAC and lights and hell, even having to treat dirt and, like, buy acres and acres of property, that's gonna make a massive fucking difference.
Mhm.
That's probably gonna have the biggest impact if they can get it to work in a truly scalable and cost efficient way. Um, and then I think as far as like regs, I don't want to like make the prediction that like we're gonna have federally regulated or descheduled cannabis or any of that sort of stuff. But I do want to say that like the Biden admin was like thought to be at least when they were initially coming in to be much more favorable to cannabis, and it really wasn't. They didn't do much of anything to make
Mhm.
any real meaningful impact at the federal level, at least in my opinion. Insofar as like business, right, which is where you're ultimately going to feel the difference, both as an employee or as a consumer. Um, uh, but everyone seems to have, like, this negative connotation with Trump and that it's like he's gonna shut down weed and all that. Truthfully, I do think, you might actually see it,
Mhm.
from him only on the basis that he's, like, a numbers guy, as far as I can tell. So, like, that's the whole obsession with, like, tariffs and the billions and billions and all that sort of stuff. Um, but, like, it's a sector that's, like, primed for growth that is artificially constrained. Um, because it all at the end of the day has to do with, your access to banking. That's like a big
Mhm.
fucking
Yep.
deal. Payment services when it comes to the dispo. So like you don't have to go through this like weird convoluted system where like I'm using my debit card and it's like an ATM transaction, but you're like converting my fucking money into Bitcoin and then instantly redeeming it back into cash, but you can only do it in like integers of $5 or $10. So like if you buy $30 worth of stuff, then I have to withdraw 40 from your bank account and give you $10 of cash back. Like shit like that is very costly to do. It's not very great as a consumer to deal with. So like things like that need to kind of go away. the tax implications, the descheduling, and those are like the biggest barriers, right? It's not a technical problem anymore. There's really good growers out there with years of experience. There's really good chemistry and manufacturing people like me with years of experience who know how to do this shit right. Um, so the problem is like a policy and an administrative one. And I think under that like context, if it gets sold to him the right way, and it's really contingent on like who's talking to
Mm-hmm.
him about all this sort of shit. Um, but that being said, like if the thing that's stopping a bunch of people going out and getting jobs and paying taxes and generating value, that can then be taxed by the federal government or state government, if that's the shit that's in the way, let's get rid of that. I think that's like a poignant argument
Mm-hmm.
to someone like him, where I have this feeling that like with some other administrations that we've had, even Obama going back, right? Like they were doing raids on
Right. Yes,
dispensaries
they
and
were.
stuff. That got stopped with, what
The
was it?
Cole
The Cole
memo.
memorandum?
Yeah, the Cole
Yeah.
memorandum.
And they basically said like, "Hey, if the state's regulating it, don't fuck with them."
Mm-hmm.
Right? There's so much bigger fish to fry. Like we've got fent coming through the
Mm-hmm.
fucking border. I don't think pot is on that list of stuff that needs to be all too concerning. And then certainly if that does happen, then the big thing is like what are MSOs going to do about that? Because and Aaron and I were kind of talking about this earlier. Um, and I've been in these rooms and I've been in these conversations, but like if I have to buy a license in every one of these states, it's a
Mm-hmm.
couple million each state, right? I have to invest in all this infrastructure for each state,
Mm-hmm.
all the equipment from like a technical operations point of view, right? I just need better vacuum ovens and better processing equipment if I'm working in Illinois because I have to meet these artificially high bar standards for like residual solvents or whatever. Versus like Oklahoma, I mean, that dab can blow up in your face,
Mm-hmm.
and the state will be like, "That's cool," you know. So you have this whole spectrum that kind of dictates the cost to do business. Um, so if you have a federal framework that like fixes all of that, and essentially just says, "Hey, fuck the state," like they can do their own regulation thing, but like here's the ultimate rules that like you have to abide by if you want it to be able to leave your state. Um, that's going to be a pretty big deal because like how do you navigate that? Like I know we all want to say that like all the MSOs and stuff are greedy and it's big weed and stuff, but like they're businesses.
Mm-hmm.
They gotta work, right? And there's people who've invested time and money into building these things. No one was complaining 6 years ago when you were able to get weed through the medical program, but now 10 years later, it's a fucking problem that they exist. This is the logical consequence of constructing the system in that way. That isn't to mean that it's perfect and that we can't change it, but I certainly don't like the wholesale negativity on it. Um, but also in the same token, like we all want federal legalization, but if you think for 1 second that an MSO that's like in for a penny, in for a pound, with all the state regimes and everything, and have spent all this ludicrous sums of investor
Mm-hmm.
money to buy all these licenses and to stand up all these facilities, is going to be okay with the feds basically just sweeping in and saying like, oh well, there's a new sheriff in town, you're going to do it this way. They're too invested, I think, in the way things are now, and that's going to pose a big problem because someone like me, if I were to go and get investors and they do a federal framework, I'm going to start a farm out in like Colorado or California, and then I'm going to do all my shit there. And then as far as processing and stuff, maybe I go to a place somewhere in the middle, like Kansas or something, like centrally located for distribution, bring all that stuff there, grow the weed where it grows great, bring it to a different state where I can get like good cheap labor to actually manufacture and process it into something you'd want to buy, and then ship that off to New York, LA, Chicago, and so on and so forth. Like that's the way it's ultimately going to end up
Mm-hmm.
because that's the way they do beer.
Yep.
It's the way they do crops and stuff, right? They're not trying to grow shitloads of corn to feed New York City and New York. There's mountains and forests. It's not a great place to do that. They grow it in Illinois, in Nebraska, Kansas, right? So cannabis can be the same way, but we're not going to get there until there's some sort of federal framework. But that's where you're going to really see it take off. I think right now we're still like playing this game where like each state is like creating different rules.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and certainly like the Republican, and I mean that like the republic isn't we live in a republic and that's like our mode of government, kind of likes it because you can see like Illinois did it their way.
Mm-hmm.
And you can see like we can look apples to apples and see like what the revenue is, what the quality of the products are, the customer experience with all that. Michigan totally was like, fuck that, we're gonna do it this way. And you get to see how that works. And you get to see like the quality of products that come out and how safe and ethical they are, and so on and so forth. So certainly this has been a great run with like every state doing it differently. But I think, for the sake of like employment in the space, I think for the sake of just growing it as a whole, um, that's going to be where you start to see a lot of money come in and shit really start to take off. But right now, like the space, even in Illinois, like people are selling their licenses.
Yeah.
I've worked for the last two businesses I've worked for, like spent an arm and a leg to secure infusion licenses. Um, but they're not doing anything with them because they're fucking worthless. You can't grow your own weed, and you can't process it yourself. So you're beholden to guess who? The original license holders
Hmm.
in the state. Right. So like it's just going to be really hard to go to people and convince them to give you a quarter million or $500,000 for you to build out a facility so you can essentially be your own middleman. It's just not a viable model. And like the only two that are really kind of attractive to get are the dispensary licenses and the grow licenses, but both of those are artificially capped. So then you have this situation where it's like, great, I got a dispensary license in like Markham, Illinois.
Right.
I'm not for the cost of that license, I'm not gonna really make that money back,
Yeah.
but everyone's fighting tooth and nail to get the dispensaries in Chicago or along any of the borders because they're reliant on people coming in from out of state and basically just smuggling it back. So you're not even selling to Illinois residents. Um, so that's like kind of a stifle. And then on the grow side, they did all this social equity stuff, but in practice, those people aren't well capitalized for all the reasons I listed. You know, it's just like not a great market to operate in. And then a lot of them got sponsored, from what I understand, from like the big guys, but like they own them.
Yep.
So is the license really this craft grower if, like, Cresco's backing them? It's just another Cresco license, or it's just another GTI license or whatever. Um, so, like, there really isn't this diversity that all of them are really championing, at least as it relates to, the diversity of, manufacturers or growers, and the array of products that you as a consumer have to pick from at a
Well,
dispensary.
they don't want the social equity places to be profitable or to work, because if they don't, then they don't have to issue any more licenses to anybody else.
Yeah, and that's exactly the same reason why they're butthurt about the hemp
Yeah.
stuff, because it turns out, like, hemp is a double-edged sword because 'cause you'd certainly have, actors that are not good faith actors, right? So they are trying to slip some boo-foo through, and it's doggy doo-doo. It's got all this other shit that they paid off some fucking lab
Hmm.
to okay, right? Like, that is true, but 2 things can be true at once, right? And it's also true that, like, there are a lot of good faith actors out there like me in companies. I can name a few, but the point being that they're making good product
Yeah.
and it's made with like good integrity. They have good processes. There were a couple other people. Future 4200 is a great place to see some of this. But we did double blind studies at our facility that I was running. So we took the same sample of CBD isolate, labeled it as like 3 different
Hmm.
batches, and sent 3 samples to like 10 or 15 different labs. So like the analysis guy, right, who's actually taking my sample and actually doing the work, thinks that they're 3 different batches of CBD, so on the surface, you would expect 3 different results, but in reality, it's all the same shit, and then I had tested it, like, in triplicate, in our facility on our HPLC, with NIST certified standards and stuff like that, to know what it precisely was, and then wanted to see, like, what all these other labs said, and I got such an incredulous fucking range of answers, right? And I got everything from, like, it was, like, 99.91% pure, and I got everything from 90% to 102%.
Wow.
So,
Oh,
like, who's testing it makes a big difference. Um, and also the reality is like, it is done by
the
people.
fuck
Right.
is
So, like, how
102%?
much
I don't mean to cut you off. What the fuck is 102% pure?
so that's actually not indicative of them doing something wrong per se, right? It is essentially an artifact of how you're essentially testing all this stuff. So essentially, you can measure something within a band, right? So you're not like counting individual molecules. Essentially, we're using a heuristic. So it helps to kind of get into the detail. So essentially, um, standards are standards because they have a very precisely known amount of analyte in them, right? There's precisely 1 milligram per milliliter of this standard, right? So I take that and I run it through my machine. And actually, I can show you what that would kind of look like. Um, Let me see if I've got one that's more like clear cut. Yeah, I didn't write all over this one. You just make sure like not giving away anything. Yeah, this is just normal. So this was I don't know if that like comes through.
No.
Can you see that? Oh, that's a shame.
Oh,
Oh, because my
oh,
light's a
there you
little
go.
bright. How about
It's a little
that?
bit better. Yeah.
Yeah. So you can see there's this peak here,
Hmm.
right? So essentially, you have your stuff go through this pipe, and then you shine a UV light at it, and then it essentially responds back at a particular intensity. But depending on the chemical that you're analyzing, has a different response. Um, so, like, you could have a lot of something in there, and it gives you a very small response. And then conversely, depending, maybe a different chemical can have a very crazy response, but like nominally it's not that much. So just because the peak bigger doesn't mean more, right? It's just a measure of like this intensity. So then the idea is you take the standard, run it through, and you know for a milligram of material, I get this response, right? And it's like this, you're specifically measuring the area under a curve. And then you take your sample that you don't know what the amount is, and then you run it through with the same parameters. And then if that same compound is there, it'll come out at the same time, but that intensity, depending on how much of it is in there, will vary. So then you can essentially know that if you have a yardstick, right? So you can say that, like, okay, well, if something is a foot long, it's like this long, right? But I've got something that's this big. So how many fractions of this foot is it, right? You use this standard to basically measure against that, and then you could say it's 6 inches or 4 inches. Um, so you do essentially the same principle for HPLC when you're measuring all these different compounds. Does that
Yeah.
answer your
Yeah.
question?
I mean, if it's off of a measuring stick that is 1 foot long, but you go over the 1 foot mark, like, what the hell is it then? Right. And if it's still just a
Yeah.
measurement of, like, well, I have to express that in some way. But
Right, and so then the I guess to wrap around and close it out fully, so, like, the yardstick is, or I guess in my case, I'm holding, like, a foot-long ruler, right? But that ruler is a foot. But the thing is, like, when you're actually taking it and measuring, like,
It's a
with the sort of ruler, you can only resolve to, like, a certain level,
it's a
right?
snapshot.
So, like, that's not what I'm really getting at. I'm saying, like, if you wanna use a ruler, it's really good to measure inches, and it's really good to measure, like, centimeters, but, like, when you dig down to it, like, it's really hard to measure millimeters, right? The markings aren't on there. Could you guesstimate it? Yes, but it's not gonna be that accurate. So there is, like, a certain resolution based off that yardstick you're using as to like how finely you can measure something, right? So you can test the same thing, and this is why I sent everything in triplicate, right? You can test the same thing and get a variation in the results. That's normal because you're not going to get 100% precisely the same response when you put the same sample through, right? There is a limit. And so sometimes, right, if you're dealing in the case of something being like 100% pure, sometimes you just get a little more of a response. Like the sensor inside that machine is only accurate to such a thing, um, right? And samples do degrade. That's another thing too, or sorry, standards, right? So if there's a procedure like you're supposed to change those standards out, and measure them like every time you run the machine and stuff like that. But like again, this is a human endeavor and it's prone to some degree of error, right? So like you can get instances where you get like 101%. Like, but like notionally, that doesn't make sense as a concept. How is something 102%
yeah,
pure,
yeah,
right? It's either 100% pure or less.
right.
But that's like an artifact of those sort of limitations to how you're actually testing this sort of stuff. Um, but yeah, the more concerning part about all of that was the fact that like I had multiple companies, even within the same batch, say that one was like 92%, one was 95, and one was 97. But like it's the same thing, and that's a really big delta, right? You're talking about 5%.
Which is,
So
yeah.
like
And like you said, when you
in the
scale that
spirit of
up
it,
to a massive number, and then it's 5% of a massive number, it becomes a very massive number itself. So, like, yeah, anything that's off is off. But
yeah, and that makes a big difference when you're purchasing. But not only that, like the truth of it was like cheating is hard, right? So like if you're gonna lab shop, Cool. I found a place that'll tell me my shit's 102%. Awesome. I could have closed the book there and then sent all my stuff there. Um, but like, what do you do when they close or go out of business or get fucking raided because it turns out they're committing fraud, right? And now you're implicated in it. What do you do?
Right.
Right? You gonna find another lab? That's like a lot of work.
Well, and then when you
Um,
find the other lab and they actually are doing something a little bit tighter and they run a different rule of regulation, and now your shit isn't 35% every time you send it through, and it's 22% like it naturally has been for the entire time, does your entire just shit blow up in your face anyway? Nobody's buying your stuff anymore anyway, right? Like, oh, you're just not that
exactly.
good at producing. And you literally could sit there and go, no, we were the same exact. Everything is the same. The laboratory and the, well, it doesn't matter, right? Because now these factors that people are measuring this thing by are like falling apart in their face. And that's why, yeah.
People fail.
Yeah.
But, like, the truth be told, it's a lot harder to, like, and at the time, we didn't have our HPLC, and I still wasn't entire trustworthy of, like, our own testing. So I wanted, like, a reliable place that had people as smarter than me doing the testing as, like, a second check, right? So I wanted someone who didn't wanna necessarily give me the answer that I wanted to hear or give me inaccurate results. I wanted someone that was gonna give me accurate results. So that way, like, when I'm then going back and looking at like how we're generating, in this particular case it was CBD isolate, right? How we're generating the CBD isolate. I want to mess with ways that I can do it faster or cheaper. Um, but the thing being is, well, if you're giving me inaccurate results, then I don't know that the changes that I'm making are actually making a difference or if they're harming it, right? So I want to know that my results are accurate, even if that means I'm getting numbers that I don't want, right? And so that was the spirit of doing it that way. And so the hemp space has a lot of that sort of stuff. But for every one of me, there are another guy that does the exact opposite, and he's doing that because he wants to find somewhere that'll give him the number he
Hmm.
wants, and you're buying it. But certainly, insofar as like the diversity of like products that you can get, the ease of access, the cost, like hemp is like way better for all of that. And you can find some really good shit. They're doing rosin, doing live resin and cured resin out of hemp derived D9. And these MSOs and dispensaries are butthurt because like now it's actually like a realm of competition in some sense, at least as it relates to like the integrity of the product and the quality of the product. And they're getting blown the fuck out.
Hmm.
Right? And the only way they can really like, the expensive thing is what I was talking about earlier, right? Actually hammer down and figure out, like, what you're
Do
doing
better.
and refine those processes. Yeah, but that takes time and money, and they don't want that. They want the quick answer for a variety of reasons. Shareholders want returns next quarter,
Yep.
right? Um, so the easiest way is to use your regulatory largesse, lobby the government to say, make that shit that they're doing
Hmm.
illegal, right? And then all you'll have is what I sell. Um but inversely, it's muddied by the fact that, like, you do have, like, shitty actors in the hemp space that are just there to make a quick buck. They're snake oil salesmen.
Yeah. It is
Yeah.
unfortunate.
I, mother of mothers, brother. Alex, I could literally sit here and talk to you for hours and hours.
Well, you
We
did.
Yeah.
did. We actually talked for a good couple hours.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But we could continue this conversation on for a while. But uh, I do respect your vision for this thing and your insight towards this thing as well. I think that like having your perspective on it um, definitely helps validate a lot of what Aaron and I constantly are saying too. There is so
You
much.
guys are right on the mark about a good deal of things that you guys speak about.
I think a lot of times, like let's just get this thing right because all of us have had some thing come from it, right? Like I
Hmm.
don't really care. At the end of the day, like it is a place where I work, but I can get a job somewhere else. I'm smart enough. Like it doesn't really matter. I just want access to this thing, and I want, I'd like it to be cost effective, and I'd like it to be effective, and I'd like it not to be some garbage bullshit that is, lied about, hidden in some packaging. Uh, Whatever. But I also, um, this thing, no matter what, like I said from before, it's like cannabis is one of the coolest Swiss Army knife tools that
Yep.
we have out here, and there's a lot going on for it. Even if it's just the blueprint for how we break down other things with yeast and build them into this thing that we actually want, there will always be I guess, a demand then for the truth of what is the flower product, right? If you grow a good flower, whatever.
Yeah, you're always gonna have people like you and me who, like, yeah, they can make, like, some space weed,
Mhm.
Yeah,
but, like, I'm not, I'm still gonna like my flower, I'm still gonna like
Right.
my carts,
bing,
you know? And you're always gonna have that, but at the end of the day, it's really just about the people buying your
bingo.
product, right? And what do they want, right? And if the big thing they want is drinks, then let's give them drinks, and let's just do it in a way that's, like, safe. Although, please, for the love of God, no more seltzers. Like, can we do, like, an infused coffee? I'm not a White Claw guy,
Yeah, no
um,
more seltzers. There's
but
a lot of drinks coming to the cannabis market in Illinois, at least. I know that they are in a lot of other places, but just very simple 2 ounce little, easy to kind of knock back, but also dangerous to knock back because people used to eat all the gummies, not actually absorb it. Now it's nano emulsified. Boom, you're actually going to get the whole 100. It might be a
Mhm.
little bit different. So there's a little give and take, but um, yeah, the market's getting there
Mm.
for that. And I,
Yeah.
every day where I'm like, oh, how the fuck do they come up with something new? And then like I go into work and I'm like, what the fuck is that? Who even ordered it? How do we even
Right.
know to order it? What is it like? But um, no, I think no matter what, all direct testing aside or everything, this plant, no matter what, the provability of it or the unprovability of it is a beautiful fucking thing. I've enjoyed giving my time to it. I will continue to give my time to it and my efforts towards it. um, but I absolutely can't thank you enough for bringing your perspective and
Mhm.
your level of knowledge for this thing into mine and Aaron's little thing we've got going on here. We're just a couple of guys who sit on a couch and bullshit and whatever.
Mhm.
But I imagine that for a lot of people who have listened to us do this for long enough, they will hear you come in very
Mhm.
technically and prove a lot of the situations that him and I have spoken on. Um, but also to add a perspective of it to like, don't think that right now is the end, right? Like it's
Right.
nothing more than the beginning, if anything, right? There's so much more
no,
that
it's always getting rewritten, and a lot of it is all subject to change. I think that's the biggest thing, and, um, like, for those of you who don't necessarily, like, work in the industry, the biggest thing is true in all markets, which is vote with your wallet. If you don't go and buy this crap, right, then they've gotta adapt,
Mhm.
right? That's, like, the biggest thing. But as long as there's, like, a complacency, it's like, "Yeah, I'm just gonna go to the dispensary and buy this Boo-Foo. I know it's Boo-Foo, but whatever, it's all I can get." Then nothing's gonna change. Like, the biggest thing for them is dollars and cents. Don't believe, like, the propaganda stuff where it's like, "Oh, we're all about, like, fostering this community, man," and it's all
Yep.
bullshit, right? At the end of the day, the only reason, even if that is the truth, the only way they can actually do any of that is through money, right? They gotta pay people to go out and push those initiatives or do the education or whatever. And if they're not making money, then they need to reevaluate
Yep.
like what they're doing, right? So, if that means that you don't like the stuff that's here, go to fucking Michigan. Go get that stuff,
Mhm.
right? And support people who are doing things the way you like it, right? And it's going to force a lot of these different places to adapt. And certainly, I think most prominently in Illinois, that's going to be the biggest difference, right? Because when the tax revenue drops,
Mhm.
you better believe with the what $1 trillion deficit the state's running, they're gonna come and do some investigation,
oh yeah,
right, and try to figure out, how to adapt that.
Oh
oh
yeah.
yeah, yep,
All
million
right.
percent accurate. And I said, man, I your perspective at this is something that I think a lot of people should also listen into, right? Like it's no matter what, progression will come and things will change. But the way that we can make the impact and the ways that we can really adjust this thing, like hold some integrity to yourself, right? Some integrity,
Mhm.
and that no pun intended, but hold some of that for yourself, and like um it doesn't, like you said, support the people that you think are doing it correctly. I support dope people. It's
That's right.
literally the whole message that Aaron started this with that I
Mhm.
bought into. And I said, you're absolutely right. There are people who have been doing this correct from forever, do it with a lot more integrity, do it with their chest out. And we're putting our faces and names out on the line a lot of times to defend some of these
Mhm.
very non-provable instances sometimes, right? But like also too, like I firmly believe, and I also anecdotally have watched on repeat these same things come up and come up and come up. How do you fix it? Well, like you said, how do I fix it? How do I fix the problems that I have immediately right here? Well, I make the best of it, right? And like you said, the best way to do it is vote with your wallet, man.
Mhm.
Spend the money in the place that you think somebody support the dope people, right? Like
Mhm.
in a lot of our community here, they come from places where they are allowed to, they have some access that isn't just a shitty dispensary that is forcing you to not be. So, like, they are supporting the dope people, and like
Yep.
there's a big part of this market that doesn't really give a fuck about the regulations, doesn't give a fuck about any of the testing results, see anything. What do you have there? Is it that good shit that I want?
Yep.
If it is, I will give you my fucking money for it. Like, I spend my time all
100%.
day trying to get this money, and I'm trying to tell you I will give it to you. I desperately want to give it to you. Just represent what you're giving
Yep.
back to me with some level of respect or integrity or whatever. And ideally, this relationship will go together even better than some of the fucking chemical bondy things that we were talking about fitting like gloves, right?
Mhm.
Like,
Yeah, and I think the big thing is just to exercise skepticism, right? Because just because it's the regulated market doesn't mean that
bingo,
it's healthier or safer, right?
bingo.
Because I think I read recently there was an operator out of Michigan who's, being investigated by the state, and they're alleging that they were essentially backdooring, cannabis.
Mhm.
I don't know if it was precisely from, like, places like California and Colorado, or if they were, like, picking stuff up that was like hemp and then turning around and selling it in the regulated market as cannabis. But, like, shit like that is going on.
Mhm.
And granted, um, like, what you see is the ones who get caught. Right, and then you have to kind of posit that there's some percentage of it going on that you're not aware of, right? And certainly the financial incentives, especially in Illinois, are there, right? Because margins are fucking thin,
Mhm.
tax burden's high, you know. So how much of that stuff is going on? You just need to be leery. I'm not saying that it's happening, um, but like just don't take things for granted like that. I think that's probably like the biggest thing. But I wanted to give you guys a shout out. I was so eager to do this with you guys. You are two very dope people, and I like supporting dope people. I think you guys are pretty spot on with a lot of the stuff that you talk about in your podcasts. Your most recent one, David, you went on like this Tim Dillon-esque rant.
Mhm.
Aaron called you out for it, and I was like, I don't think there was one part of that I was like, this fucking guy is wrong. Like, no, this guy's hitting the hammer on the head, or the nail on the head. Um, but it goes to your guys' credibility as well. You guys know what you're doing. You practice what you preach, and I think that's the biggest thing.
Oh, yeah. It's
Golly, I'm surprised if you could see me blushing over here. I don't know. I got sunglasses on, so the color's all fucked up. But
right.
no, I really do respect you, bro. I respect that. I can't thank you enough for the statement too.
Mhm.
Um, there is a lot of thanklessness that goes on with what happens over here, right? And like neither one of us are looking for anything, right? But I genuinely care about the progression of this market. But also,
But that's exactly why I think you guys are gonna be successful, and I think ultimately, like, the marketplace as a whole, is just gonna get better. Because like, you can only bend it so much before it breaks,
Mhm.
right? Like, it's got a little bit of play in it, but, like, there's a certain point where it just snaps and it don't
yep.
work. And I think for the cannabis side of things, we're fast approaching that, because like, you're not gonna be able to pay the wages to encourage, like, the new generation of people to come in and pick up this mantle and keep it as good as it has gotten.
And we can only
You're not gonna
subsidize it
incentivize
so
people to get into the
much.
space. Right, and, like, the marketplace is only gonna have such an appetite for it, and certainly we're starting to see that now where it's like there are some
Mhm.
licensed people that I've talked to where they are straight up working for free.
Yep.
Well, brother, we
Like,
we went
um
1.2, 1.3, 1.4, 1.5 in Illinois, okay, since 2020. That's the way that our progression has gone. But we went from 50 licenses to 100 licenses to 200 licenses. So we grew 4x on the distribution side of, right? But we only grew fucking whatever, half a percent or whatever of the actual full market. So I just don't think that like I think that we scaled at a weird rate. The caps again on how much you're allowed to produce is it's weird. You're not allowing it so that they could even bring down prices. There's been some price compression, but I think that that's slightly bred out of the few new guys that are in town, and we can maybe edge them out because they have to sell at the higher rate because of all that recent investment and whatever. So there's a lot of weird like that, but
Yeah, and they're trying to scale their
uh,
operations and
bingo.
stuff too. So, like, you're paying that higher price, but, like, it's the way for them to essentially crowdfund
Hmm.
investment, right? It's through the sale of their product, but then that comes directly into conflict with, like, them trying to also compete in the marketplace, when you're dealing with people who are already pre-established and been doing this since, like,
Yeah.
2017. So, like, it's not the best way to go about it.
Yeah.
Boys, it has been a joy to not talk a lot and listen to people smarter than I. Honestly, Alex, anytime you'd like to come on the podcast, obviously, you were the first person I asked, and I've been waiting a long time. Anytime you'd like to come on and talk about anything, you're more than welcome to. Do you want to, before we go, do you want to give any shout outs or tell people how to get a hold of you? Maybe they need a house or
Oh, well, I wasn't gonna, plug the
I
real
mean,
estate side. My wife and
plug
I,
whatever you
are
like,
real estate
please.
brokers.
Yeah.
No, no, honestly, if anybody has, any sort of questions, I'd be happy to give you my email, Aaron, and
Yeah.
then as part of the show notes or
Yeah.
whatever, if you wanna throw it in there for them to contact, I can put something like that out there, and then if anybody has, like, any questions or whatever, I'd be more than happy to do that, and then I also do, consulting on the side as well. So, like, if you're, like, an operator,
Hmm.
and doing manufacturing and stuff like that, I'd be more than happy to lend a hand, and then if there's something big there, then obviously, I'd be willing to come on board and try to assist with stuff, at least with what I know and where I can add value.
Hmm. Dave, plugs real quick before we go.
No, Alex, I've respected the hell out of you from the moment I met you, pal. I think
Hmm.
you're one of the coolest people I've had the opportunity to speak um, about cannabis with. Um, Even
Hmm.
where I'm very humbled in listening to you speak on some of the aspects of it, and it's one of the it's a privilege of mine. I can't thank you enough for coming on and spending this time with me. I'm actually privileged to have your personal cell phone number, so maybe at some point you might be bugged by me, but uh,
Yeah, of
Yeah.
course, dude.
I like I said, dude, I whatever it is your next steps are in life, I wish you the
Hmm.
absolute best with it. You are somebody who deserves the absolute best, Bill.
Absolutely.
I appreciate it, man. Certainly, we're gonna have to find some, local events, popping off and, meet up because it has been a very hot minute. I don't think I've seen you guys since, like, a Token
Yeah.
Tuesday,
Yep.
like, maybe 6 months,
Sounds
7
about
months ago,
accurate.
something like that,
Yeah,
so
since that little
we're
stint
definitely due for a meetup.
I when we worked together for a few moments, huh? That was like a day or two. But no, I really do thank you more than you know. I look forward to it, and even if it's just breaking bread sometime together
Yeah.
and finding a few
Absolutely, dude.
moments to bullshit and smoke one, I'd love to.
Maybe this spring when I have an open house to my new place, I'll invite you guys both over and we can, yeah,
Oh, hell yeah.
you know
That'd
what
be
I
cool.
mean.
I would love
So
that.
everybody else, we love you all. Smoke weed every day. Peace.
Yo, ding dong, we're done here. Time to go.